Good morning. I'm really very, very happy to be here to speak at the very start of this very exciting event. And I want to really wholeheartedly congratulate this initiative, Anita and her colleagues, for starting, in fact, this Regions Refocus to 2015 initiative. It's something that I think I've missed because, you know, there is this huge amount of endless number of discussions, workshops, seminars, conferences, online discussions and webinars and so forth, but somehow they seem to be somewhat siloed into sort of civil society here, governments here, and so forth. And I think what we see here is this very important initiative of building solidarities amongst regional actors, amongst different civil society organizations, and sort of across these sectors of civil society, government, and the UN organizations, to build solidarities on certain progressive agendas. And I think that this focusing on the regionally grounded experiences and feminist analysis of transformation policies and issues have been very much a gap in the debates that we've had so far in framing the post-2015 debates. And why is this so important? And it's basically because there are too many issues that are off the table. So I want to emphasize that there are many important things that are on the table, but we should also be looking at what is off the table. And what has been very striking is that the systemic issues of global governance, the global rules, the power structures that determine those rules are in fact, those are systematically off the table. And that was the case with the Millennium Development Goals. And that was highly criticized, but this round of discussions has not made much progress in putting them on the table. They seem to sort of get trapped in between different agendas, even in the way that the debates are structured. And so the issues of global governance and the global economic system that is at the root of so many of the ways in which the winners and losers are defined in development, in something that is called development, but that leaves behind not only winners, but also losers. Losers in terms of countries and individuals and groups. So those rules are actually off the table in these formal debates about the post-2015 framework. And it's the rules of trade that govern the economy and society, rules of intellectual property, taxation, and the absence of rules such as climate change or on the volatility of food prices, and the unequal power structures in the process of decision making. All of these things are basically off the table. And so I think this is a wonderful space that brings back these issues on the table and insists that they be addressed in the official debates. And the second reason why this is important is because of the process. As I mentioned, the way in which the debates have been structured, I think, has not allowed enough space for bringing together the developing of the solidarity across the different sectors of civil society, government, to formulate sub-regional alliances and positions. And the third reason is framing. The reason why there are all of these issues that are off the table is because of the ways that the debates are framed. And I've been thinking about this for a long time, actually, as I have been doing studies of the Millennium Development Goals in a project called The Power of Numbers with a colleague, Alicia Yemen. And this project was supported by FES and by the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. Since the emergence of the MDGs as a consensus international development agenda, targets have come to define thinking about development and defining what is important and what is not. And so strategies have become target-driven, focusing on interventions that deliver short-term gains, such as, for example, in the area of food that I've looked at, fortified food as a solution to malnutrition, when that might be a sort of palliative, but that does not prevent the further recurrence of malnutrition that is deeply rooted in problems of lack of education, poor health, lack of water and sanitation, but also gender inequality and systemic issues like rising food prices relative to wages. So I identify, and this is something that is in the World Survey of the Role of Women in Development, for which I prepared an input to a chapter. I have concluded that the major threats to food security include climate change, rising prices and increasing volatility in world food markets, competition investments in biofuels, and competition with foreign investments in land, all of which put pressure on vulnerable households, whether they're small-scale producers or landless agricultural workers or the urban poor. Yet much of the mainstream initiatives to combat hunger are for investments in technology to be developed in North American universities. So the narrative of international development, driven by targets, justifies these quick fix solutions while sidelining the long-term structural issues that create poverty and inequality. Development, remember, is a process of economic and social change that expands opportunities for many, but actually also disrupts lives and livelihoods for others in the process. So I enjoyed reading the report of the regional workshops. And they coalesce on structural and systemic issues. They draw attention to lack of UN policy, lack of attention to some of these issues that I mentioned in UN policy discussions. And many of the policy initiatives and recommendations emerging from these workshops address the need for shifts required for the achievement of sustainable development that is sustainable economically, socially, and environmentally. So many of these reports point to generic global level issues. For example, the undemocratic and north-biased international financial architecture, the global lack of application of human rights norms and standards in both national laws, but also in the international agreements, such as the privileging of economic, financial interests over human rights priorities in trade agreements, whether it is in the agreement on agriculture or in TRIPS agreement. The bias of global trade and taxation regimes towards big business, glossed over or left out of UN-led conversation. The market-led financial private sector focused development model, such as is becoming very dominant in most national development strategies that are part of global initiatives or regional initiatives. The program on infrastructure development in Africa, which was a subject of the African consultation, is a very good example of that. Investment priorities are on energy projects, and that has garnered, I think, $40 billion total, or maybe that's the target. And they are focusing on infrastructure for extractive industries. And that is, in fact, the opposite of the objectives of structural change and diversification that African economy so badly needs to actually depart from the dependence on commodities. The workshop actually referred to it as colonial bias to exporting energy as a development model. The distributive consequences of such projects is then lost sight of. The report says the relative speed with which PIDA is being implemented in comparison to the Africa mining vision raises concerns that the dominant global economic powers will continue to privilege the invitation of private investment on the African continent under the guise of development, further imperiling regional and continental initiatives towards changing the dominant paradigm. In addressing these and many other obstacles, I've only mentioned a few of the points that are raised in this report. Regions Refocus 2015 spotlights the kinds of policies that should be put in place. So what I like about this initiative, it is very much focused on developing policy alternatives. And this policy alternatives needed to achieve the structural transformation necessary to realize sustainable development. And that, of course, emphasizes a need for the shift to broad-based inclusive development, but also the primacy of the state and communities with a focus on distributive concern, particularly gender justice, regulation of private investors, multi-stakeholder engagement, embedded local accountability mechanisms, fiscal reform, and more. By structural transformation, I mean particularly economic diversification and social transformation that addresses oppressive power structures. And I come away in the end after reading this report with two issues. The need to refocus our framing on the human consequences of development and people as the true wealth of nations, and the central role of the state being able to play the role of a developmental state. A developmental state actually was a term that was coined by Chalmers Johnson to describe the role of the state in Japan's economic transformation in the 20th century, and being from that country and being a daughter of a government economy official, that says something to me, that the developmental state is one that intervenes as an actor in the economy to pursue development. And in that context, of course, development did not include adequate attention to issues of inclusion, of participation. But the fundamental point is that the developmental state is one that is prepared to act as an economic agent and to intervene in the economy when necessary to protect and pursue public interest. So, as this day of deliberation starts, we need to focus on questions. How can this approach be furthered in this policy arena? The report identifies many concrete initiatives, but the important issue is strategy of the how. How can these initiatives make up a strategy for shifting the narrative of development? How can civil society and government work more closely together on these kinds of systemic and structural issues? Where are the policy spaces? We need to move from the target-driven narratives that justify short-term gains and privilege private investment, sidelining the issues of the role of state, the distributive consequences, the feminist analyses that focus on power structures. We need a narrative that brings back these systemic issues of global governance and national governance that can rectify social and economic injustices that are part of the pattern of development that we are seeing today. So I have no doubt that in spite of the weather, today will be a day of creativity, inspiration, and constructive debate that will move the process forward. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sakiko, for your very lucid remarks and for situating the importance of global economic justice and the importance of regional solidarities toward that. So I'm Anita Nayar, and I'm delighted, together with my co-founder, Catherine Tobin, and our entire team, to welcome you to this launch of Regions Refocus 2015. This initiative has taken shape very organically over the past 9 months, and I just want to share with you some elements of that journey. Before I start, however, I want to acknowledge my dear father, who passed away during this period of 9 months when we were convening these regional workshops in 8 regions of the world. And I mention my father because, like him, many of you in this room are generous of spirit and desirous of making a just world with one act of kindness at a time. I thank you, and I thank you very deeply for the support and the encouragement that you've given us over these 9 months, and this has really been a remarkable, truly a remarkable process of collaboration. The premise of Regions Refocus, the premise of the work is to really advance progressive and feminist policies that are rooted in regional perspectives. The intention is to rebuild regional and feminist solidarities between movements and with our governments. Regions Refocus addresses the deeper structural and systemic changes that are necessary to restructure our economic, social, and ecological relations toward justice. We also acknowledge that there are global obstacles to realizing this. Among them, an unstable international financial system, a multilateral process that entirely fails to regulate private capital, and an unprecedented level of public-private partnerships that are accelerating the scramble for resources and assets and markets. Our intention is to refocus the new development agenda to address the intrinsic power relations that are creating these conditions. How do we reverse state subservience to private capital? How do we revive policies of economic self-determination? And how can we reclaim and reimagine the role of the state without replicating the ways in which it was captured during colonization, or how it was compromised in the post-colonial or in the current era of financialization? How do we ensure that issues of patriarchy and racism are understood as actual structural variables that are fundamental to forming any solutions? These concerns are explored, as Sakiko shared, in our collaborative report, Regions Refocus 2015. In each of the chapters, transformational policies are proposed. In Southern Africa, we explored the issues of infrastructure development on the continent and looking at a new program called the Program for Infrastructure Development of Africa, advocating that we need to ensure that the projects that are put forward really genuinely support structural transformation, and what are the criteria to ensure that that happens. In a West Africa regional workshop, we looked at issues of extractivism and brought together policymakers and civil society to really strengthen state capacity to implement regional regional policies on mining. There's the Africa Mining Vision and the ECOWAS, the West Africa Mineral Development Policy. And a feminist caucus there put together a statement on the links between gender extractivism and financial flows in Africa. In the Pacific, we had a workshop on gender and climate policy, and it was groundbreaking because it led to the first joint civil society and women's machineries statement on these issues, and it created a new initiative called the Pacific Partnerships on Gender, Climate Change, and Sustainable Development. In South Asia, we focused on sexuality policy, which is, as we know, typically neglected in the global sphere. In the Caribbean, we looked at participatory fiscal policy and planning, social protection, renewable energy, climate finance, and all from a very sharp feminist lens. An Arab states workshop took the issues of investment and development, taxation and redistribution, addressing gender and other inequalities within this frame. The recommendations that emerged from the Arab states meeting will be taken forward in a social summit with the League of Arab States quite shortly. In Latin America, we had two regional workshops. One was on the issue of illicit financial flows in relation to development policy, extractive industries, and taxation. And here, a feminist caucus came together to put together a statement on the links between taxation and gender equality. And this is being taken forward in the financing for development discussions. The second Latin America workshop looked at education policy. And here we examined the structural barriers to the realization of the human right to public, free, secular, and lifelong education for all. And finally, the 9th regional workshop was brought together European civil society with European Union delegations to New York in an exchange of perspectives on financing for development. So over the past weekend, 35 activists from across these regional workshops, including policymakers, came together for what we've called a cross-regional exchange. So we are here with you today to acknowledge the importance of international solidarity in all of this work. We spoke of the need to reconfigure, to reconstruct, and even reimagine who we are in the regions while we respond to the global context. Our discussions centered around the three topics that you'll be hearing throughout the course of the day. The first session is on the fetish for foreign direct investment versus economic determination. The second session is on sexing and gendering development. And the third, reclaiming the state versus the corporatization of governance. Immediately following the first session, we had planned a series of film interludes, and that will now be moved because of this impending snowstorm. Thomas Gass, the Assistant Secretary General of the UN, will be joining us at 11 o'clock instead. So he'll join us at 11, and then we'll have a question and answer period with him, and we'll show you 3 short film clips after lunch. And the film clips are just roughly 2 minutes each, and it's really to speak to very specific issues and visualize some of the issues that our panelists will be addressing today. These are drawn from, the first film is Gold Fever, which looks at the impact of gold mining and a gold mining transnational corporation in Guatemala. The second feature film is by the name of Bamako, and it looks at international financial institutions and putting these literally on trial in an African village. And the third video is on women's rights and women's movements in shaping the Arab Spring. So let me close with a few words to share that power is interlocking, it's diffuse, and it's extremely destabilizing. We know that it's destroying life on our planet. Some people in this room are living at the forefront of this destruction and are also at the forefront of creating solutions, the best solutions. An interlinked vision is absolutely fundamental in order to take in what is happening to us and in order to conceptualize the nature of this problem. It's the only way we'll understand the unity of suffering that is taking place, and to really work towards solutions that we believe is our endeavor and it's our opportunity. So I thank you for coming here to the launch of Regions Refocus and for working together to really build that just world, one act of kindness at a time.
Thank you very much. I'm going to 10 minutes or 50 minutes is not big enough. So I'm going to talk about the topic under 3 main headings. First is the promise of foreign direct investment. Secondly, the reality. And the third part, I don't know if Jane has mentioned, I'm from the Tax Justice Network Africa and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, so I will focus on the tax aspects of FDI. The starting point is, I don't know how many of you are done development studies. At the beginning, there was a very simple logic about the role of FDI in development. It was said, without saving, there is no investment. Poor people cannot save. So domestic saving was not considered available for development in developing countries. So the emphasis given was for them to get the resources necessary for development from outside, for indirect investment, loans, and official development assistance. I will not go into the other 2 sources of development, as it was called then. But what was the promise from foreign direct investment? It was supposed to create employment, transfer technology, diversify the economy, and save foreign currency and enhance the productive capacity of the economies and create a linkage effect within the economy. So what has happened? I speak from my experience in Africa. As you know, 70 to 80% of Africa vegetates still in subsistence economy. There is no diversification. Most of the foreign direct investments were of extractive nature. They were just taking out resources without any value addition and beneficiation. I don't think Lubumbashi has changed ever since it was colonized by the Belgians. Africa still exports primary commodities, and most of the foreign direct investments were in enclaves without any linkage to the rest of the economy. The jobs created are mostly the types of sweatshops, employment in the sense of skilled labor and decent wage is very small. So in this sense, it has not fulfilled the promise which was given to it. So as I said, our focus is around tax. So I will start by linking FDI with tax. The first part of tax is, the first aspect is the lot of tax incentives given to multinational companies or foreign investors in Africa. These are foregone and forsaken public revenues, and they have also unleashed in Africa a stiff race to the bottom competition. At the beginning, most countries were giving 5 years of tax holiday. Now, in some countries, it has gone up to 20 years. We were doing a workshop in Dar es Salaam on this issue, and one of our participants asked, you ask holiday after you have worked. How can you start work by taking a holiday? So, and then the other thing is, again, another example from Tanzania. I've been in the region the last 14 years, and I know a hotel which changed its names every 5 years. So 5 years tax holiday, just when you are about to start paying taxes, then you sell it to another company who knows, which are related. So it's not only tax incentives do not only cause tax revenue loss in the form of foregone income, but they also affect the domestic tax policy. If government revenue is not collecting taxes from foreign investors. The revenue has to come from somewhere. So that's why you see the rise of consumption taxes in Africa, which will harm the less well-off and the poor population. The other one is, if you get, as a foreign investor, guarantee of investment from your own country, and you get the tax concessions, just imagine risk-taking national entrepreneurs in this unequal competition with foreign investors. So this is the tax incentive, the consequence of tax incentives to attract foreign direct investment on the rest of the economy. And the major thing is, I think we have now to talk about tax dodging. Let's start by looking at facts. You know, in the mainstream development discourse, it's starting to change a bit, but there is a perception out there which makes Africa a continent which is on the life support from money it gets from the north. But if you look at these serious studies, Africa is a net exporter of capital to the rest of the world. A very conservative estimate puts it that Africa loses about $50 billion a year through illicit financial flows. And then from the absolute figure, the biggest share, over 60% of illicit financial flows, it is because of business practices. It's not as assumed by many because of corrupt African leaders. And then the other thing to look at is, why is it that a small island like Mauritius is the biggest investor in India? Why is it that, for example, the British Virgin Islands have 34 companies registered per inhabitant? I heard it from Barack Obama. He said there is a building in the Cayman Islands where 12,000 American companies are registered. So when you look at all these things, then you look at how the source itself is makes you a bit suspicious. Then when it comes to tax practice, I'll just give an example from a case study which ActionAid did in Africa, just by following the practice of a multinational beer company. The finding of the research is that a kiosk beer vendor in Accra paid more taxes than the multinational company. What happened was, the first is the concept called tin capitalization. This company claimed it has borrowed, I don't know how many millions of money from a bank situated somewhere in Mauritius, and they're supposedly paying interest on these loans. Interest payment on loans is deductible from tax liability. The second one is this company claimed they have paid financial management services to a financial company somewhere in Switzerland. Payment for services is deductible from tax. And then they claimed, although the beer in Ghana does not carry the name, they claimed they have paid royalties for using the brand in Ghana. How many millions? So, you know, profit, it's a very easy calculation. Profit is equal to sales minus cost. If you somehow manage to inflate the cost, you will necessarily reduce the amount of payable taxes. So these practices, I cannot go into the details of transfer pricing, which is happening to dodge taxes through foreign direct investment. So just to conclude, some questions to you. Foreign direct investment, I think nobody is against legitimate profit seeking and the contribution of foreign direct investment to develop. That's not the issue. But to play this role, is foreign direct investment to be the driver or a supplementary to the development process? The second one is it to be embedded in a national development strategy and respond to the priorities of a sovereign country, or it should be driven by supply? We have it here, take it. The last one is about regulation. Is it to be left to laws of the market or market forces, or it should be regulated? Here, especially the new generation of investment treaties are very dangerous. Actually, for example, it is almost restricted to negotiate performance agreements with investors these days. Finally, we in the tax justice movement, we say that tax is not a cost, it is a contribution that each one of us should pay to have a coherent society, a cohesive society, and sustainable development. So is not tax practice one of the criteria? We have to look at the behavior of industries, private investors. So tax practice, I think, should not be a criteria to differentiate between investors and scavengers. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Dureje for getting us off to a really good start today. And we have experts here from Africa, the Middle East, and Pacific to dive in deep to this topic of the rhetoric versus the reality of foreign direct investment. And just to situate this discussion briefly before turning to the panelists, I would just say that Dureje's comments and the topic of this panel on FDI and investment in general are especially critical because we're at a turning point in history. Right now, we're experiencing the biggest investment boom in human history, 8% of global GDP. And the leaders of the world economy feel that this investment boom has to be magnified considerably in order to overcome economic stagnation and give a boost to global growth. And so we will see an intensification of investment promotion. And there will be two aspects of this that we haven't seen before, at least the type of model we're seeing going forward. The first is the explosion of public-private partnerships in investment to attract unprecedented amounts of private flows into not just single PPPs in a country, but whole portfolios of PPPs in the developing world. So we'll see infrastructure or education or health as an asset class. And the hope of the global leaders is that this $85 trillion in portfolio flows like pension funds will be attracted into development, and we will see a boom of development like we've never seen before. And I just raise this because if there's a contradiction between the promises of foreign direct investment and the actual what is delivered to citizens in country, we're in big trouble because we need that connection in order to achieve sustainable development goals, in order to achieve a triple bottom line that we fought for in Rio +20 by a triple bottom line, economic, social, and environmental outcomes. And so, meanwhile, the spaces for civil society are closing. And it's exciting that we have leading civil society experts here to address these questions. And I want to turn first to Ikal, who I had the privilege of seeing in action in Africa this past year. And Ikal, I wonder if you would talk about the promise versus the reality in your region, particularly when it comes to rural communities and foreign direct investment in extractive industries.
I think one of the things we see in the conversation around foreign direct investments is the growth, economic growth, and the conversation's always around developing countries and their need for economic growth. But again, if you look at it, the FDIs are going into natural resources, natural environment, so more extractivism. And then at the same time, you hear governments, and then at the global spaces, the policy spaces are speaking about participatory, citizens participating in the conversations, and you really can't see the spaces for the citizens to come in. And so by the time the foreign direct investment discussions are happening in the capital cities, yet the investment, the extracting of the resources, whether it's in agriculture, land, extractive industry, mining, oil, it's in the rural areas, and the communities are not part of this conversation. And then in all these discussions, you again see a decline in the environmental standards. So while we're discussing the foreign direct investment that's going into the countries, you see a relative, a continuous destruction in the ecosystems. We're not looking at what do we lose in ecosystems and water, in land, especially when we're giving land for agriculture, how much water do we lose? And do we see that the rural populations are actually, as their economy is growing, are we actually destroying small-scale production spaces because of this sort of foreign direct investment? So you can see a really huge decline in support for small-scale producers because we're thinking about the large-scale. Take the example for Africa. All of a sudden, there's an increase in large-scale acquisition of land, all in the space for foreign direct investment in the region, yet we are in many ways disenfranchising small-scale producers, yet we know that 70% of the world's population is fed by small-scale producers. So you see that. So you're seeing a decline in spaces for small-scale production. You're seeing a reduction, even while we speak about participatory citizens' participation in policy making, in investment, in growth in the country. You don't see that. You're seeing those spaces closing, while at the same time we're speaking about looking at the relationship between foreign direct investment and economic growth. And so are we looking at GDP, or are we looking at household economic growth? And I think that's where we need to start taking the conversation.
So this contradiction that Dereje has started us out with, you see that contradiction in your local context.
Yes.
That's very, very helpful. Let me turn to you, Zayed. Could you reflect a bit on the trade and investment agreements that you see going forward and the accelerating FDI, and particularly, Dereje left us with a question of how these flows are regulated. And I know that you're very concerned with the capacity of states to regulate these flows in a way that achieves a triple bottom line, that achieves local development and increased productive capacity. Could you take us down that road?
Yes. First, I want to stress on the fact that foreign direct investment have an important role in policies of economic growth and of development of the countries. But the link between foreign direct investment and development and growth is not systematic, is not automatic, and it's not a direct relation, especially that the kind of sustainable development and economic growth that we are looking for is the development or growth who is generating jobs and contributes to the enhancing of the productive capacity building of our countries. So and it's important also to say that talking about the Arab region, the Arab economies have generally witnessed kind of a regress in their productive capacities, and mainly in productive sectors, manifested in stagnating shares of agriculture, manufacturing sectors mainly, and a rapid expansion of the low value added services activities. This combined with a regress in the contribution of productivity to employment. So addressing unemployment as a main challenge in the region cannot be detached from really addressing the challenge of reviving the productive capacities and breaking away from the concentration on patterns of low productivity and low job generating sectors. So re-establishing the development policies in the area of agriculture, industry, and services would necessitate a structural transformation that is only enabled through a deliberate and dynamic policy framework under which trade, investment, and finance policies are established to support and expand policy space and not to burden it. So designing trade and investment policies to benefit development objectives is crucial to a successful development trajectory. Otherwise, rules established through a limited the policy tools that allow tightening the linkage between investment and development.
Well, this is an important contribution because many of us in the room are working on sustainable development goals, and we're working towards curbing global warming, and yet, you know, what we hear is that there's a disconnect between our aspirations and our means of implementing our aspirations, a profound disconnect. So we've heard here that the economies in the Middle East are actually regressing, and certainly the statistics, whether we want to look at youth employment, whether we want to look at, as you mentioned, the growth in this low-end service economy, these statistics really bear out your message, and it's a very important one to deliver to this forum. Tete, I want to turn to you because at Third World Network, Africa, you know, for so many years, you've been looking at this question in the context of trade and development. And one of the questions that you've been so helpful in articulating to the bigger audiences is the question of whether foreign direct investment actually supplants domestic investment or whether it supplements domestic investment. And going back to Dereje's comment, we, I think, all want to complement national development strategies. That's really what we're about, is country-led processes. So your specialty is right on the mark.
Thanks a lot, Nancy, and hi to everybody. I think that the point is, you know, critical that foreign direct investment can contribute to development in our regions only if it supplements and supplements domestic investment both in the private sector and the public sector. Unfortunately, over the past 20 years, our governments have not been able to apply the policies that will enable foreign direct investment to do the kind of thing that it should do. On the contrary, what we've had, either through providing better terms to foreign investors or even giving them some guarantees, is that foreign investors actually dissipated domestic accumulation and actually supplanted in certain ways what local investors can do. I mean, in my country, Ghana, where I come from, just recently, the government has agreed to sell off the National Electricity Distribution Company, sell it to foreign owners as part of the conditions for accessing the $500 million grant from the United States government as part of what they call the Millennium Challenge account. Now, this National Electricity Distribution Company, one of the main reasons why it's under distress is that the Ghana 40% of its revenue, right, is owed to the, by the Ghana government, by the military, by the police, by the government departments who don't pay their electricity bills. Okay, so if 40% of revenue is not being paid, you'll be in distress. Interestingly, one of the conditions for the company now being sold off to foreign investors is that the Ghana government now guarantees that to pay all its debts from the past to the present to the future. And in addition, has allowed the application of an automatic tariff adjustment program, formula, which effectively is to guarantee earnings for the foreign companies. Now, these are two things that the Ghana government was not able and willing to do to domestic investors, for instance. So we have a situation in which a foreign investor is being given more or less preferential treatment against domestic investors. Secondly, the problems of electricity in Ghana are more in the area of generation rather than distribution. So you will have expected the foreign investor with all this expertise and capacities to go to the areas where there's clear capacity deficit, instead of which they are now coming to the low-hanging fruit and plucking it and using it as a profit to take away. And as a lot of studies and experiences from Brazil and Thailand, Korea, and Korea showed, in fact, in electricity distribution, to guarantee the kind of returns that is being guaranteed for the foreign investors will actually be at the expense of other strategic areas like access of electricity to small and medium-scale industries, to farmers, etc. So what we do have, and this is not just unique to the electricity area, it has happened for the past 20 years in health, in water, and not only in Ghana, but also all over Africa. We have a situation where foreign direct investment is coming in with the muscular support of its home government, like the US, to get better terms and conditions in a way that dissipates domestic capital accumulation and formation in our economies. And in this kind of situation, it's not possible for foreign direct investment to deliver on this promise against all the evidence, against all the analysis. And it seems to me that to continue to believe that foreign direct investment can deliver on this context, it's almost like what the first President Bush said some time ago, not the second one, that this is more or less like voodoo economics. In other words, it's like a fetishism, as it were.
Thank you very much, Tete. This is also an important message. If foreign investors are being privileged over domestic investors, then in fact it makes our task impossible for foreign direct investment to complement domestic investment, because domestic investment is being suppressed. It's an alarming message that we'll come back to. Nolene, your concern, I think, is just at the heart of this movement for sustainable development goals, because we've depended on social contracts between governments and citizens to ensure that citizens have the right to development, the right to decision-making, really. And how is that working out in your region of the world? How are you seeing the decision-making process, the creation or the destruction of social contracts?
So, I mean, context matters is the first thing, which is why Regions Refocus, 2015 is so important for I think those of us in the Pacific as elsewhere. But the first thing I'll say about that is, in order to be able to answer the question, to discuss the questions of foreign direct investment, and particularly around the idea of economic determination, I think you have to look backward as much as you do to what is happening right now. And so for me, the real issue is around whether you can have social, cultural, economic and environmental self-determination. One as a person, one as as collectivities of people, whatever those various collectivities are, and in terms of the states within which we live. So if you look at the decolonization process and kind of the building of states in the Pacific, you see that it's fairly recent. So that's 1960s into 1970s, and we still have some of the last remaining colonies in the region. So that in itself is an issue of agency. But then we also have to think through the fact that when these states were coming into being in the Pacific, that it's in the time of the structural adjustment policies and the conditionalities and around IMF and World Bank loans. So that in itself, I think, is a very interesting point. Is that while you're building states, you then are also afterward, pretty soon afterwards, starting to get the narratives not just about foreign direct investment and the need for that, but also starting to be around privatization of state enterprises and this encouragement of this rhetoric of development through a free market economy, whatever that free means, particularly in the context of small island states, that range. There's a huge range and diversity. The interesting part for me, though, is that I think it's also very important to talk about the contestation by the region itself. So as well as having this idea of, kind of foreign direct investment and the structural adjustment policies, you also have this narrative through the Small Island Developing States process of special circumstances of Small Island Developing States and LDCs. So that's incredibly important, I think, particularly right now, to be able to protect that, whether we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, the post-2015 Development Agenda, or indeed into Beijing +20 and also UNFCCC. So it's incredibly important to protect that language is another thing. The next thing is that I think the mixed messages do abound in my region. What I see is a protection maybe of, this idea of an internalized vision of what it is to be Pacific is incredibly important, and the narrative is very strong. But then you also have this encouragement of a freer market model, and that feeds into a lot of the kind of contestations right now in the region around Australia and New Zealand, around the re-entry. I know all of us have heard about the Pacific pivot, the US Pacific pivot, but also around the whole conversation that we have to be having around BITs and around EPAs. But I like to talk also not just about the states themselves, but about the fact that civil society has been part of this contestation from the very beginnings of states. So we've had the nuclear free and independent movement, and out of that, this amazing regional treaty that was about the protection of a nuclear free zone, and we have some in this room, both from non-state and state actors who've been part of that movement. In the 1990s, we had some of the Melanesian states that also were pushing back strongly on privatization of land, because obviously in small island states, the land question is incredibly important, not just in terms of the monetary value of land, but its spiritual value to us, the medicinal value to us. There is an incredible diversity of ways that we feel connected to land, so that's incredibly important. In the 2000s and right up to now, you also start to see some of the legal and frontline challenges, civil disobedience, the use of human rights systems in order to challenge some of these issues of extractive industries, and I think that's growing into the future. But coming back to FDI and what FDI, this is incredibly important. Is it about tourism? And that has its, its value to the region, of course, but it also has the problem of repatriation of funds, where those funds are going. It also is a problem now because we have online bookings. So is that money even coming into the small island states? That's a question. But then we also have to talk about mining and logging. We have small communities that are having to stand against some of the most powerful transnational corporations in the world. And that's an important series of conversations. If we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, it's so much not just about economics, it's about social and social and environmental sustainability. And the last little bit I'll say is, I think have the responses of the states been coherent? No, they haven't. They've been varied, but that also is about this entire development paradigm. And I think that's what we've been talking about this weekend, is about a paradigm shift. Because if you're trying to take your way out of problems in development, that's not going to work, we know. We also know that if states are going to contest, they're trying to do it, small island states are trying to do it in the midst of a series of multilateral negotiations that we're trying to cover with the same kind of depth and scope that others with far greater resources have. That's an incredible challenge. The last thing is that I'd say you can see tensions around the distant water fisheries, you can see concerns around the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, you can see concerns about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. I'll talk later about some of the ways that people are coming up with solutions. But I think what we see in the region is these multiple groupings that are forming are not a bad thing in the region. We have the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, but we also have other groups that are trying to decide how we respond to these incredible challenges. Because it really is about agency. It's about agency of individuals and the need to look at sexual and reproductive health and rights, to look at the fact that 8 of our states still criminalize LGBTQI people, to look at the fact that we need to be working in environments where we're supposed to be in New York all the time. I think the Pacific governments have been amazing in the climate change negotiations. And they still will play a very important role in terms of not just adaptation mitigation, but this whole question of trying to get the loss and damage mechanism into place by the end of this year. That's an incredible challenge. So that's probably what I'd say now.
Well, thank you, Nolene. I think each of our speakers has really delved into the questions that Dereje presented us with in terms of thinking clearly about what foreign direct investment contributes and what it takes away from national development, and that we are looking at a net bottom line. Before turning to the audience for discussion, I just want to raise one point that I think has been overlooked, and that is that in this new era that we're entering, it's an era of mega, giga, and tera, million, billion, and trillion-dollar projects. So in the old days of development, we talked about appropriate scale for energy, transportation, water, other sectors, agriculture. That discussion is mostly gone. And we are talking about mega, giga, and tera billion-dollar projects. And that puts a different light on the questions we've been discussing today. Because when we hear our panelists talk about agriculture, infrastructure, including the infrastructure for mining and logging, we're talking about these things on a scale that we have seldom seen before. And so the challenges to land acquisition, the challenges to community and national development are not situated in small spaces anymore. They're situated in continents and on a level that those of us that have been doing this work for decades have really not seen before. And so the means of implementation are key. And the last thing I'll say before opening it up is that we really haven't spoken explicitly about public-private partnerships or multi-stakeholder partnerships. And there are two important things I want to say about PPPs. Number one is that citizen participation is constrained because most countries say that these huge mega agriculture infrastructure projects are national security issues. And number two, they close down civil society space because of business confidentiality on the part of firms investing. So civil society has to reclaim its role in these debates. And so as I open it up to all of you, I want to hear not only your reflections on the challenges that Dereje and our panelists have presented, but I also want to hear your input about how civil society can reclaim its space in these debates.
I'm Tove writing from the European Network on Debt and Development, Eurodad. And thank you, first of all. These are very inspiring and interesting reflections. Also, the fact that you're left with the feeling that we're facing the same problems in core all over the world. And it doesn't matter which continent you are on. It's basically a lot of the same types of problems. But I think I like the question about how we can reclaim a space in the debate. But I'm also wondering, how can we win? What does it look like when things actually change? And if we look back, can we see from history or just from our own personal experience, can we see the times when we've had an impact, when things got better and we actually for once won? I think, I mean, at least for my own part, I think there are examples, both historically of major wins, but also privately of okay, there things actually got a little bit better. I mean, for example, the small island states in the climate negotiations, at least they didn't go down without a fight. And I think they are, I totally share your viewpoint that they've done a very good job. And they have also sometimes won. So these are examples of the little guys standing up against the big powers and winning. And I just think in this debate, if we want to solve this, I would love to hear also from the panel, what does it look like when we win?
Aldo Cagliari with the Center of Concern in Washington. And I wanted to maybe hear from the panelists a reflection on what do these trends mean for some of the achievements that have been made in the last 10 or 15 years in terms of recovering domestic, the policy space to rely on domestic sources of finance. So, for example, in 2000, many people didn't even want to talk about national development banks. It was like, the wrong idea. It had been dismissed. And now, this is back on the agenda. People are talking, this is important to have. Countries should have national development banks. Reliance on domestic sources of finance, particularly, for example, national pension funds, another interesting idea, important, using those funds to support infrastructure. But then when we hear that now even these means of financing are going to be lumped together with foreign sources of funding, in joint projects that have a huge scale that transcend national boundaries, well, what does that mean for those achievements? My impression is that it is kind of subverting them in a way. Now, national development banks, instead of being a tool for recovering national policy space, is going to be part of a huge, supporting some huge project that is agreed somewhere in the G20 or by the World Economic Forum, and it doesn't have anything to do. Same with pension fund money. Instead of being a tool for supporting national projects that may be decided on the basis of national realities, may become part of joint funding with CalPERS or some other big institutional investor, and some private equity funds. So what does this mean for decision making that we thought we had recovered by having those issues back on the agenda in the last 12 or 15 years? Thank you.
All I'd say is that's precisely why I tried to place into kind of my intervention the instances where, because it starts to feel like that's all you're doing is talking about the losses, because there have been so many and so many challenges on so many fronts. Where the successes are where I think frontline groups have been holding ground, but also then maybe using various systems, legal systems or human rights systems to, that to me that's an instance where you can point to some successes. For me, another success is when you see maybe specific example, parliamentarians from 16 island states who are prepared to stand up for sexual and reproductive health and rights in the Asia-Pacific Population Conference, and also are prepared to defend against, quite regressive state positions in Asia-Pacific on sexual orientation and gender identity. To me, that's a win that people were saying couldn't happen. Now, it may be only a contingent win, and we do have to do a whole lot more work in the region on where you then convert that and how that keeps going. But for me, we have to count those successes, because otherwise you start to feel like you're on a downward trend, when I feel like there is a lot of contestation. And then the last thing I'd say is, I think things like our Pacific Partnership on Gender, Climate Change and Sustainable Development is another attempt where we're saying, yes, we have to have the difficult conversations with state parties. Yes, we have to have the difficult conversations with regional development agencies. No, it's not going to be an easy thing to do, and we have to get into the heart of matters like public and private partnerships and really look at what that means and where the state is, I feel, being too weak, and maybe they're feeling like we're a little too naive in our positions. If you're not in those rooms having those contested, arguments, then I really don't know where we're going. So for me, it also needs the states to be able to, to see us as it doesn't even have to be partners. It just means that you're willing to get into the ring and have a really strong, honest conversation. And the last thing I'd say is, a win is when you have a paradigm shift. And one paradigm shift I see in our region is that there really is an understanding, I think now, which I think is still needing to happen in many other regions, which is climate change changes everything. It's about survival, and it's about survival of small island states. It's about survival of our species and many other species. We have 150 to 200 species a day disappearing. By 2020, we're saying that 80% of the Great Barrier Reef is gone. Profound things that we've never dealt with before. So success needs to look like those of us who are willing to shift our small lenses and to say we have to do things in ways we've never done before. And I think we're doing that. And yeah, probably that's it.
Tete, in response to Aldo's questions about how these realities relate to trends vis-a-vis policy space on the ground and the use of domestic resources, could you address that? Because we have seen a turning point, as Aldo has said. You know, the World Bank tried to put national development banks out of business, but they're being created left and right now and strengthened. And pension funds and taxes, as well as the funds of banks, are all being harnessed to this mega model that is supersizing development. So could you respond to the policy space and the fiscal space questions?
That's a tough one. What I can say, though, is this. I think that there is a dialectic of contestation and response. So you're right. In the Northeast, there has been a backlash where we're beginning to reclaim the value of development banks, etc., and their role that they can play. But I think that we also have to recognize that the neoliberal champions are also now doubling their effort. And in fact, in Ghana, pension funds and their privatization has become part of the regime. I mean, so workers are struggling and it's expanding. What I would say, therefore, is that actually what we are seeing is a widening of the struggle in which the same instruments that we are defending are the same instruments that the other side is trying to create, to use to occupy more space. And that probably is the way I can put it for now, that what we won as development space, we cannot take for granted, but it has become a platform for more struggles. And actually that links me slightly to the earlier question, that all I can say about winning is that actually maybe the conditions for struggle are better today, for the simple reason that what used to be seen as a problem of developing countries that the World Bank is doing to us in Africa or Latin America is also now at the heart of Europe. And what we need to do is to learn that because the problem is becoming all of us, then we have to learn the art and politics of collective global mobilization around that.
I would like to say something about the win and loss. I think that it's a real struggle where changes, it is very difficult to measure change and to see where there are real winning or losing struggle, but we can feel that there is kind of a mounting resistance. I don't want to be perceived as a populist, but in reality, you can see what happened in the Arab region, for example, in terms of Arab Spring. I know that in some countries it is facing real difficulties or challenges, but in some other countries processes are going towards a real change. And yesterday we witnessed what happened, for example, in Greece and Europe, which is reflecting something about this mounting resistance and rejecting all these kind of austerity or other systemic issues. So I think that we are not able to measure, but we are able to witness some changes taking place. When it comes to the labor law, one of the main challenges, since we are talking about the investment, I mean, it was promoted often that there is a need to create the enabling environment for the wise investment or for the good investment. And one main component for the enabling environment, beside, let's say, this taxation, it was the flexibility in the labor market, where, I mean, the modification and the reform or the amendment to the labor law in order to adapt or to attract foreign investments. This is one point. But the most important, and at least in our region, let's say that the formal labor market, the informal labor is becoming more and more important, and it's sometimes estimated to be more over than 40%, that they are not covered by the labor law. Do we really need to expand the labor law in order to cover these, or to create kind of a different system in order to protect those who are not covered by the labor law? But this also saw another, let's say, a dimension of the problem when it comes to the labor rights in relation with the labor law and the labor market.
Two things. In regards to the labor issues, you see a big shift. So right now with a large standard rail gauge in Kenya that is ideally supposed to open up markets, help the producers access markets. But you're seeing this has been won by a Chinese company, and you're seeing over 400 employees coming in to do basic labor, unskilled labor, just in putting the rail gauge. So seeing situations like that, and communities and citizens rising up to it, but then it's really trying to, as Ziad has said, opening up the spaces and trying to, because FDI is really about labor, technology, environments, enabling environments, and so it's the conversations that I had in the closed boardrooms. And just picking up from what Nancy said about PPPs, I mean, one of the key things we're really struggling with is now changing the conversation and saying that how do we bring in the citizens in the PPPs? And because a lot of this private-public partnerships are based on land, so that now citizens can actually use their land as natural capital. And you're seeing huge, huge projects where we're saying, okay, fine, instead of you saying you're paying the country, even if the argument is all wrong, but just as a starting point, who owns the land? And if the land is owned by the people, then why can't the people be 30% shareholders in the investment? And that automatically changes the argument where they say, oh, no, we will pay you money for the land. What is the value of the land? And in many cases, they change the economics, and where they say the value of the land is based on what you are producing on it. Now we are saying, no, the value of the land is what are you making out of the land, and then you pay me based on what you're making out of the land. So that it's always trying to change that. And for me, those are the sort of changes. I think the economists are helping in creating the winning spaces where we're changing the compensatory mechanism of saying what were you plowing and what were you getting per year to what do you want my land for, and what is the value of the portfolio of what you want to do to create that.
Matty Cahonan from Christian Aid in London. I guess I can make a statement about the private interest and the private finance in the whole discussion, because it seems that coming from different regions that FDI-led growth model, we haven't got away from that in the official policy statements of many governments, and indeed they're increasingly part of our aid policies from Europe. So the statement would be, I think a lot of FDI is bogus, as they say in England, so fake, because it's conduit FDI that goes through tax havens, and therefore it's shifting that same amount of money around the globe through tax havens rather than actually being productive FDI that creates any kinds of capital investment, jobs, infrastructure, or that sort. Therefore, if we are to treat FDI as a developmental flow, we must know more about it. FDI is extremely opaque, very badly accounted for, and extremely poor statistic. It doesn't correlate with anything if you try to see whether it correlates with development goals or anything of that sort. So we need to know where this FDI is coming from, which countries it's going to. Looking at Luxembourg's FDI statistics, one of the world's biggest FDI sources on paper, but we know it's bogus FDI because their FDI to GDP ratio is over 2,000%. So Luxembourg is not investing in the world. Luxembourg is the big laundry machine of FDI in the world, which creates the conditions whereby FDI may be dodging taxes, may be dodging regulations, or other benefits. That's a statement. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate you bringing us back to Dereje's point about tax avoidance and tax evasion and the incredible price in terms of outflows from developing countries. And I think our panelists have done a great job in exploring the questions that Dereje presented us with in terms of whether investment, foreign direct investment is complementary to domestic investment, whether it supports a sustainable development plan at the national and local level, and whether it's regulated in a responsible way so that it's not just investor rights that are upheld, but also citizens' rights in a democratic space.
Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by thanking Regions Refocus for inviting me to this exciting and dynamic new initiative. I think it's an understatement to say that we are embarking on what is going to be a momentous year by all accounts. In September, all eyes of the international community will be on New York. Heads of state and government will gather here from 25 to 27 September to endorse a universal sustainable development agenda. This will be an opportunity for the member states of the UN to adopt a shared vision of where we all want to be in 2030. A vision informed by citizens, civil society, major groups, and other actors. Indeed, the views of these critical stakeholders have shaped the way we talk about the post-2015 development agenda today. There has been a great momentum and indeed passion around the elaboration of this agenda. It has brought renewed energy to the United Nations. The General Assembly open working groups, 17 Sustainable Development Goals set out an ambitious starting point for this shared vision for humanity. There are also high expectations for a new far-reaching financing compact to be adopted in Addis in July, and much hope for an ambitious climate change agreement coming out of COP21 in Paris in December. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, member states have already made great strides in elaborating the post-2015 agenda. There is some broad understanding on its structure and thrust. The Secretary General said that the new agenda should include a compelling and principled narrative based on human rights and human dignity. It will require serious commitment from financing and other means of implementation, and it should include strong, inclusive public mechanisms at all levels for reporting, monitoring progress, learning lessons, and ensuring shared responsibility. It is in no small part thanks to the civil society that the international community got this far in elaborating the agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. Civil society's engagement has been unprecedented. Never before has so broad and inclusive consultation been undertaken on development. Millions of people took part in national, thematic, and online consultations and surveys supported by the UNDG. The direct and active engagement of parliamentarians, local authorities, business, and civil society has also been critical. The Open Working Group on SDGs demonstrated how an intergovernmental process can dialogue with civil society and draw from its contributions. As a result, I believe that the 17 SDGs and 169 targets it proposed resonate with many parts of civil society. They are also a clear expression of the vision of the member states and of their commitment to an agenda that can end poverty, achieve shared prosperity and peace, protect the planet, and leave no one behind. I'm pleased that member states decided to sustain this momentum and continue engaging the stakeholders in the negotiations. Ensuring that the agenda is owned by all is critical to guarantee its implementation. Dear colleagues, the proposed 17 goals are transformative in several ways. They fully integrate the three dimensions of sustainable development, that is economic, social, and environmental. They include a goal on climate change to be further clarified after COP21. And they critically address the peace dimensions as integral to the agenda. Beyond these, the goals focus on issues that can exacerbate tensions in the absence of strong institutions and good governance. Those include inequality and the unequal distribution of and access to ecological resources, unemployment, loss of biodiversity, and food insecurity. But most importantly, the SDGs foster a vision and commitment which at its core includes the concept of no one should be left behind, and that inequalities in all areas should be addressed. This high level of ambition and the comprehensive coverage of the goals and targets can bring about a significant shift in paradigm. A shift in paradigm that must affect our approaches to development cooperation, to accountability, to partnerships, and to financing for sustainable development. Agreeing that no goal or target be considered met unless they are met for all social and economic groups means that we will not be able to hide behind averages. We must be serious about identifying the most vulnerable groups and communities, addressing their needs, and become still more effective at analyzing and mitigating the risks they face every day, be they environmental, economic, social, or political. It is a normative agenda for all countries. All the development efforts will need to be measured against that vision. Such a visionary new agenda does not provide the same rigid guidance regarding priorities. And those of you like me who have grown up as development practitioners and who have log frames in their DNA may somehow regret that this agenda doesn't give 3 outcomes and 15 targets. Whereas the MDGs had sometimes been seen as constraining development countries' policy space, the new agenda gives more space for countries to develop their own priorities. At the same time, it has the potential of becoming a much stronger basis for accountability at the national level, between the government and the population of each country, between the duty bearers and the rights holders. Clearly, we need an agenda that is people-centered, planet-sensitive and rights-based. And this can only happen if we foster inclusive and peaceful societies and transform our economies and patterns of growth. Whereas the MDGs could be considered as covering only a subset of the global development agenda, that argument is much more difficult to make for the SDGs. This has profound implications for the diversity of financing sources that must be mobilized to cover the financing needs of the new agenda and for the way partnerships are leveraged. The idea here is not to let the public financing of donor countries off the hook, but to make sure that developing countries are empowered to raise and efficiently use national resources. Likewise, the objective cannot be to shift the financing burden to philanthropy or to foreign direct investment, but rather to use all these sources more effectively and in a synergetic way. Dear colleagues, the next 9 months will be extremely busy. As you know, we just completed the 3 days of stock-taking discussions in post-2015 intergovernmental negotiations, co-facilitated by the ambassadors of Kenya and Ireland. There was a great sense of optimism and a feeling that the new agenda can put the world on track towards a better world where no one is left behind and the planet is preserved. Many reaffirmed that poverty eradication, along with sustainable development, should remain the overarching objective of the agenda. The agreed building blocks of the outcome document include a declaration, sustainable development goals and targets, means of implementation, and follow-up and review. The intergovernmental negotiations last week recognized the importance of means of implementation and a strengthened global partnership for sustainable development. Many stressed that it will be impossible to deliver an ambitious agenda without commensurate means of implementation. Some highlighted that a global partnership should be based on universality, shared responsibility to achieve SDGs, mutual accountability, and mutual stakeholder involvement. The process on financing for development, the negotiations on a climate change agreement, and deliberations of the post-2015 development agenda are 3 legs of the same chair. They are strongly, or the same stool. I think a chair has to have 4 legs by definition, but a stool has 3 and they are strongly independent and each requires a high level of ambition and success in the other 2 forums. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me now, in closing, to say a few words on the 2015 session of ECOSOC and the high-level political forum and the importance of regional perspective. The 2015 session of ECOSOC will address the theme, managing the transition from the MDGs to the SDGs. What will it take? The aligned theme of the 2015 high-level political forum is strengthening integration, implementation, and review, the high-level political forum after 2015. It will be important to have the regional perspectives on these two themes presented to the ECOSOC high-level segment, which will take place on the 7th to the 11th July, and to the HLPF, which will take place from 26th of June to 8th July. The respective programs are currently being discussed with the ECOSOC president. Let us not forget that the review of implementation of the post-2015 agenda must be solidly anchored in national reviews, feeding into exchanges of experience and reflection at the regional level, and culminating at the international level at the high-level political forum. ECOSOC and its subsidiary system will continue to have a central role coordinating and integrating approach to a unified and universal agenda. The dialogue with the executive secretaries and the council is planned during the ECOSOC high-level segment. We therefore need a regional preparatory process that is focused, one that helps member states mobilize around certain aspects of the themes most relevant to their region and prepares the groundwork for decisions in the context of the post-2015 development agenda. The regions are each, in their own way, a microcosm of global challenges, and their perspectives are critical to the post-2015 agenda. In closing, let me thank you again for the opportunity to address you here today. We look forward to working together in the transition towards the new Sustainable Development Agenda and to translate it into reality. Thank you very much.
Tove Riding from Eurodad again. Thank you very much for the great overview indeed. I remember I was in Nagoya in 2010 and I watched the lead negotiator from the Africa group pass by an EU negotiator in the corridor and they gave each other a high five. And 2 days later they agreed a legally binding agreement. I also remember Copenhagen, the climate summit, when the head of the European Commission's delegation said, "I refuse to talk to the Sudan idiot." And he was referring to the G77. So you can sometimes see the behavior of the negotiators, and you can predict whether we are headed for another epic crash, or whether we're really heading for what we want 2015 to be this sequence of successes, this perfect scenario where the processes give each other energy. So, Thomas, you live with these people every day. What is the atmosphere in the UN?
I would agree with you that a lot hinges on the negotiators, but not everything. And certainly, and I was a negotiator for 5 years here as well with the Swiss mission, and I know that sometimes we feel very powerful as negotiators, but that power is qualified by how much accountability there is to the constituencies back home. Now, I really hope that in September it's not about, Prime Minister Modi meeting President Obama here, but much more about what they will come here to promise to their people back home. And that pressure, which is a positive pressure, that linkage, that sense of accountability has to be built by civil society. And we have the advantage, which we didn't have in the year 2000, when we didn't see the MDGs coming, but we have the possibility now, these 9 months, to build up that sense of expectation among the populations of the countries. And I think if that happens, then the negotiators will mirror the ambition. Now, I was in Davos last week for a couple of days, and the dinner on Friday evening, I mean, those who are following me on tweet, you will see, John Kerry said, in Addis, we will set new benchmarks for funding sustainable development. And he also said, we should all go there. Now, whether he meant we, the US, or I mean, that is his interpretation, and he can call me on that. But I heard those two sentences. And so I really believe that we have to lift that ambition. And that ambition starts with Addis. Addis is absolutely crucial in this regard.
My name is Yavuz Selim Çubukçu. I am the member of the Mission of Turkey, and I work as an advisor on environmental and sustainable development issues. In fact, last year I was making the statements on behalf of my mission on the SDG negotiations. What I would like to ask you, Mr. Assistant Secretary General, which I really adore, and I think we just made a couple of, not negotiations, but some exchange of ideas. The last time I was just taking place in the stock taking of SDGs, I heard that the distinguished delegation of EU was saying that they won't be recognizing the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And what do you think, for example, if we cannot be able to go along with this kind of statement, what do you see the success? Could it be possible for us to see a successful conclusion both on SDGs and FFD, or should we abide by, for example, as everybody knows, for G77, it's I think it's an qua non not to accept, this CBDR. So what would be your position or the UN position on this basic principle of Sustainable Development Goals? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think your question illustrates to some point, that we are now getting into a negotiation process, and that a negotiation process that will be tough. A negotiation process where the Secretariat needs to keep a neutral role. So I'm not going to take sides in this discussion, but I believe that there is a possibility to find a solution. And I believe that that solution can be found if there is sufficient detail in what is agreed. If the discussion remains at the level of principles, and whether you add CBDR in the first paragraph or in the 10th paragraph of the declaration part, that doesn't honestly make such a difference. What is important is that the goals and targets reflect the understanding that there is a diversity of situations out there, and there is a diversity of capacities to help solve that situation. And I believe that the 17 goals and 169 targets actually do reflect that. And so I think that's where we have to build upon. And I see, of course, there is a risk that that you, since I'm no longer a delegate or a negotiator, there is a risk that you go back into your trenches. But as was just highlighted by the previous question, that would be detrimental. And I really believe, and the discussions last week showed, that nobody really wants to go back into these trenches. Not least because the three big conferences are linked. So it's important to have a high-level ambition also in Addis, otherwise it will be very difficult to achieve it in Paris.
My name is Anya O'Connor from the Sisters of Mercy. Thank you very much. My question, in the Millennium Development Goals, we know that one of the big failures was that human rights didn't anchor the goals, not just in name, but explicitly in the goals themselves. Many of us from civil society are seeing the same issue as the Sustainable Development Goals and targets are being developed, that basic human rights are not really enshrined in the targets. And last week we heard of the move to look at technical proofing the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm wondering if you could tell us, is there an opportunity to link technical proofing to embed it in the question of human rights as well, not just a scientific look at the development agenda, but looking at how human rights will really show up in the structures of the targets to ensure that we don't have some of the failures that we had in Millennium Development Goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and this is an important question. Now, I don't think that the objective from the start was to re-establish a kind of human rights framework. But as I tried to say it just now in my speech, whereas certainly the development community was looking for a new, better, more integrated log frame, it came out very different. And I believe it came out much more akin to a human rights framework because of the normative nature, well, not because of the absolute nature of it, the comprehensive nature of it, the way that the goals and targets are formulated. Remember, the idea was to establish a voluntary framework. And so how far can you go in voluntary and yet put enough pressure there so that things will move forward and can be a strong basis to move forward, especially in building accountability. My opinion is that we have what we have now, and I must say I think it's a good product. And the Secretary General certainly also thinks that this is a good product. So technical tweaking, technical adjustment, what does that mean? The member states will have to define it. My sense is that it was mainly to see whether there are a few, and I'm underscoring a few of the targets that may have been formulated below the level of ambition of existing legally binding indicators or targets. And if that was the case, if there was like a contradiction, then that might be addressed. But I mean, this is not in our court. It is really the member states who have to decide how far they go. I would not lose too much energy on that, but much more look at an important page that needs to be written in these negotiations, that needs to be written, is the whole page about review. And in my opinion, if the sense that the importance of the review has to be strong at a national level, and the Secretary General is making quite bold and concrete recommendations in this regard. If that is the basis for a national review process, I believe that some of that accountability can be built in. And certainly the idea that no one should be left behind is deeply rooted in a human rights-based understanding of development. So we're not replacing the human rights. They are there, and they remain valid, and they are much more complex than we could have over the years, that we could have done in 2 years of negotiation. Let's use the complementarity between those two frameworks, between the human rights framework on the one hand and the SDGs on the other. And let's build a strong review mechanism in which the countries are encouraged and incentivized to present progress, and in which that strong relationship exists between rights holders and duty bearers, and that kind of accountability relationship. That's a very tall order.
My name is Faturi, and I'm from the Permanent Mission of Samoa to the UN. There are other intergovernmental briefings and also meetings taking place right now on the post-2015 development agenda. I opted to come to this one primarily to underscore the point that no one has a monopoly when it comes to implementing whatever the post-2015 development agenda is. And I think basically you also underscored that, Assistant Secretary General. I think at the end of the day, whether it's going to be 17 or 20 SDGs, I think it's how national governments localize those goals and not only just give it priority, but more importantly, make sure that there are budgetary resources so that they can be implemented. And I think this is where, when we had the SIDS conference last year, the overarching theme was the importance of partnerships. And for SIDS, a partner is a partner is a partner. And I think, why? Because I think partners, it means that there is an element of accountability, but more importantly, there is an element of trust. And I think that is why the talk now in terms of means of implementation, I think the partnership framework will be very important. And I couldn't agree more in terms of the reference to accountability, to review, and also monitoring. Because too often some people announce partnerships for self-promotion, but at the end of the day, they hardly deliver. So I think that is one aspect that I think would be very important to see. But I think there's a lot of excitement out there, and also because given the role that the civil society, they had been active participants, and I think they will hold governments to ensure that they actually live up to some of these expectations. But I always maintain that civil society is part and parcel of the society we all live in. And I think a lot of us have national elections. You are far more persuasive when you are a voter. You don't have to, I think sometimes you can actually, campaign or actually have your positions made known to all potential candidates who are contesting the elections. And I think that is happening in the Pacific. So it's also important for us to remember that, at the end of the day, we can also make decisions, because while we have negotiators who are sometimes so wedded to their own positions that sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between the forest and the trees. I think the reality check always comes when we have people from capitals, and that's why I think this is real enlightening and also very encouraging, just to see whether some of the things we say in the halls of the UN is really translating into what should happen on the ground for the people that we are here to serve. I thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just two reflections on your comments, Excellency. Firstly, on partnerships, I didn't have really the time to get into this, but I agree with you. I think that we need to explore partnerships in a completely different way. And certainly the space, there is still space to talk about and to include in the outcome document some findings and some agreement about how, or at least principles on how accountability and mutual accountability can be built into this post-2015 agenda. It's a complex issue because partnerships is such a broad concept, and then the types of partnerships are so different. So you can't really summarize it in a couple of sentences, where either in the synthesis report or in the outcome document. But it is important to build out, to develop further the existing mechanisms. And the role that the private sector plays is also a different one. I mean, if you look at the MDGs, it was really much about setting priorities for dealing with the most urgent, pressing issues in the South. And the private sector was here and there invited to be part of this. The SDGs are so comprehensive and so absolute that an essential, if not the most significant part of that implementation will be the private sector, and not what the private sector does with its extra money as philanthropy, but how the private sector does its business, how it makes its money, and especially how resilient it is to building and maintaining decent and productive jobs, for example, in contexts that are difficult. I mean, it's easy to fulfill CSR requirements, and then as soon as the production costs get a little bit high, you move to another country. I think then you haven't really contributed to reducing poverty. On the involvement of civil society at the national level, also I couldn't agree more, and I really hope that during these 9 months we can still imbue that kind of interest at national level. It's difficult. People have real problems day to day, and they're not so much interested in mobilizing for a negotiation that takes 9 months here in New York. But it is really important that we, the UN system, UNDG, civil society, everyone helps to mobilize and bring everyone on the starting line by September 2015.
Good morning. My name is Graciela Rodriguez. I'm from the Brazilian Network for Integration People. Yo pienso que falta en el análisis una cierta discusión del contexto global, donde el poder corporativo y del sector privado ha crecido enormemente dentro de los países y también en las instituciones multilaterales, inclusive en Naciones Unidas. Parte de la denuncia de la sociedad civil o parte del discurso que la sociedad civil viene agitando es la captura corporativa del poder de las transnacionales o de las grandes empresas, del poder privado, de los espacios multilaterales. Entonces, también nosotros, o sea, parte del problema es que el sector privado puede tener su papel con sus recursos para hacer sus negocios, pero están influenciando sobre los gobiernos de tal modo que es difícil que se pueda hablar en neutralidad con sectores con poderes tan desiguales. Y sobre todo si lo pensamos en relación a la sociedad civil. Entonces, el tema es cómo Naciones Unidas tiene que tener un papel especialmente vigilante de esta situación que lamentablemente es parte de lo que venimos diciendo que no tiene. Y yo quería mencionar como un ejemplo el caso, por ejemplo, que en el área de arquitectura financiera global, las Naciones Unidas han tenido un papel más positivo que el propio G20, que se autodefinió como con un papel enorme sobre la arquitectura financiera global y que no lo ha tenido, no lo ha cumplido. En cambio, los esfuerzos de Naciones Unidas en este sentido han sido más positivos. ¿Cómo esto puede ser un ejemplo positivo también en el caso del financiamiento al desarrollo y para la crucialidad de Etiopía, de las negociaciones? Gracias.
So the question was about, describing the increasing influence of the private sector and especially the big corporations at the national and at the international and the multilateral level, and how the UN can respond to this challenge, which actually skews the playing field and does not allow a real balanced discussion between actors, particularly civil society. Estoy de acuerdo con su análisis, pero entonces, ¿cómo explica el alto nivel de ambición de los SDGs? En mi opinión, la ambición que se encuentra en este momento en las Naciones Unidas, que está sin igual en las 15 últimos años, demuestra que es posible de dialogar de incluir la sociedad civil en un modo tal que el nivel de ambición sea suficientemente alto. So basically, I believe that the high level of ambition of the SDGs actually demonstrates that it is possible to involve the civil society in such a way in the negotiations that this perceived or this real, let's say, political influence of the corporate sector is balanced in the negotiations. And I also believe that this influence, that the private sector is itself influenced by these kind of negotiations. I mean, certainly, and I know that in Davos is a kind of a harmonious, rather, how should I say, surreal, let's say, context to be establishing policies, but there's certainly a certain peer pressure among those big corporations to shine and to show that they want to move forward on this agenda. I would only hope that ambition would extend, as I was explaining it just now, to the resilience of the private sector to actually stay and keep jobs and to create jobs. So that's why I'm always hoping that one day we could have an 11th principle in the Global Compact about poverty eradication and the creation of decent and productive jobs. So You know, we don't just stay with the CSR that we have now, but that we actually give a premium and a bonus or a recognition to those entrepreneurs who actually stay when the going gets tough.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us, and please join me in thanking Assistant Secretary General.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Morning. I'd first like to begin by thanking the amazing Regions Refocus team for permitting me a few moments to share some thoughts with you on sexing and gender in development. And I want to say that these are thoughts that I've been developing in collaboration and listening to and learning from and sharing with colleagues. So I'm delivering them, but in a way it's very much a collective effort. And I really wanted to begin by saying that when we speak of sexing and gender in development, we begin with the understanding that gender and sexuality are fundamental structuring aspects of human life, which determine life chances, access to public goods, distribution of resources. And I think we're at a very important moment because we're at a moment where feminist analysis and feminist development analysis is sophisticated and it's mature. And feminist economists have long demonstrated that when we apply the lenses of gender and sexuality, then we have to fundamentally alter how we think about development. So for example, if we think of feminist critiques of structural adjustment policies that have showed the ways in which gender inequalities, but also heterosexist understandings and framings of society draw on women's unpaid labor and women's unpaid social reproductive work, required women to respond as shock absorbers to crisis, but that they also produced unequal relations of gendered power. So understanding how policies may draw on unequal relations of gender, but how also they are productive of those unequal relations of gender as well. So my intervention today is really just to remind us that feminist analysis also offers more than just gender and sexuality as analytical lenses, even though those are important. And so thinking of the work of Caribbean feminist scholar Michelle Rowley, who does a lot of work on gender and development as well, I wanted to assert that at this particular moment, sexing and gendering development requires a transnational feminist praxis, hence the value of the Regions Refocus cross-regional dialogue, in which the salient analytical markers must be determined by the fields of play in which power reveals itself. So in other words, I'm talking about the ways in which the valences of power are multiple and contextual, and how we have to be attentive to these. So what does this mean for development policy and for a feminist critique of development, and also a queer critique of development? So it means that North-South power relations are also important configurations in terms of understanding power based on gender and sexuality, be it in Barbados or Jamaica or also in India. It also means that when unequal relations of power between international financial institutions and Caribbean governments cannibalize policy space, that this also has to be seen as part of the structuring of vulnerability of women, of young people, and also of LGBT people. It means that sexuality needs to enter development, not just in relation to violence, in relation to crisis, and in relation to disease, even though these are important questions, but also in relation to access to work and access to education. So LGBT rights are not just about decriminalizing sexual practices in, for example, in the Caribbean, or about responding to HIV/AIDS, even though these are, of course, important, but also about understanding that LGBT people also live and love and work in these very countries under constant economic crisis. So returning to this question of being attentive to multiple valences of power also requires an insistence on harnessing long-term planning for economic justice. So for example, Caribbean feminists have asserted that there needs to be counter-cyclical planning, which permits governments to engage in a longer-term planning and not just be responding to eventualities and crises with social welfare policies, for example. Sexing and gender in development requires not divorcing the macroeconomic from the social. They're not separate. They cannot be divorced. Gender and sexuality are not primarily or exclusively social policy issues. So investment policies may produce gender inequality. So thinking of the Caribbean region, when you have histories of gender segregated labor markets, seasonal and cyclical employment, particularly, for example, around tourism, the kinds of investment, so if we tie this to our previous discussion on FDI, the kinds of development can actually reproduce and create new forms of inequality based on gender. And this sexing and gendering of development also means we have to push back against the instrumentalization of women in development policy, which is also, I would argue, the dehumanization of women. So when we say invest in women because it makes good business sense, or invest in women as a way to ensure positive outcomes for children, for example, is deeply problematic. And, you know, doing work around ICPD with colleagues across the Caribbean and also Latin America, I remember someone sharing that there was a minister who was like really outraged at the high rate of maternal mortality. And he's quoted as saying, you know, we can't have women dying in childbirth because after all, women give birth to men. So, right? So I hope you understand, you know, what I mean when I talk about this instrumentalization of women as a dehumanization of women, and what this means in particular for sexual and reproductive health and rights. And also, as we critique the corporatization and privatization of governance, we also have to think about the other valence of privatization in the neoliberal context, which is this insistence on private solutions. So whether private is market solutions or private is that private sphere of the home, of the household, where we all know that gender relations are pervasive. So these private solutions, again, draw on unequal relations of power, and they also implicate relations around sexuality and gender. So coming close to concluding, but I want to say another point about the information and the kinds of information and the kinds of data and how that work also reproduces unequal relations of gender in terms of the way in which thinking about women's rights in development often becomes a comparison. Men's status and position becomes the baseline. And this becomes increasingly problematic as men's status and position become increasingly eroded. So the IADB has a report that's a few years old now, and with some data that's probably about 10 years old by now. But it talks about the wage gap in Barbados and Jamaica, the gender kind of income gap. And in Jamaica, it's 12% if you compare women and men of the same age and level of education. In Barbados, the gap is about double that. So are we to take away from that it means that women in Jamaica are faring much better in Barbados? Or when we use this kind of androcentric data, are we also masking inequalities in a way? So I just want to close by reiterating that feminist intervention into development policies requires heightened analysis and attention to the multiple valences of power. We need to extend our analytical resources to across the range of issues that we're talking about that I haven't had time to touch on. So extractivism in our regions, climate change and climate financing, particularly important for the Caribbean. And we have to ensure that our policies do not depend on unequal relations of gender in order to be quote unquote successful, but also that they do not produce more inequality. And that's where I want to end. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be moderating this session on sexing and gendering development. I'd like to thank the Regions Refocus team for putting this exercise together. I think it's a wonderful exercise. I'm going to cut my preamble short just a little bit because I think our session has been foreshortened already. But just to make a few kind of preliminary comments about what it is to take a regional perspective on this topic of sexing and gendering development. I think it would be fair to say that there isn't a ready-made regional perspective on how development and on sexing and gendering development at the same time, I think we've all acknowledged in our discussions that it's very important to develop and evolve a regional perspective. And part of that discussion has also been about being interested, developing an interest in one another's countries, trying to build bridges, trying to find connections that we can work with and build on, where the idea of a regional perspective itself grows from those discussions. So I think what you'll hear today will reflect some of the diversity within regions. And I think that will be part of the strengths of what our panelists will be articulating. Okay, so I think maybe a useful place to start, building from Tonya's presentation, is the question about the contention, rather, that sexuality and gender are fundamentally structuring aspects of life. And I think the big question for us is whether development discourse and policy reflects that. There has been quite a bit of writing on this within the global north, but I think it might be interesting for us to hear some regional perspectives on that. So I'm going to throw the question open to Nicole, perhaps. Nicole, would you start?
Hola a todas y a todos. In the framework of financing for development, I think all this debate is really, really important, because even if for some of us this is like an old record, we need to keep explaining why gender power relations are embedded in economic processes to policymakers, but also other civil society friends, alliances, and actors to understand why this is a structural category to understand development patterns. And why we say that? Because women and men, for instance, in its diversity of sexualities, of race, ages, experience impacts of different economic trends and globalization trends, like financialization of the economy or trade liberalization, as their different roles they have as a consequence of this gender order, as consumers, as workforce, as producers, but also as responsible for the activities of the care work inside the household and outside. And we need to repeat this message a lot, because what we have been facing at the regional level, but especially at the global level, is dominant narratives that really focus, narrow down, and instrumentalize women's rights as a mean, as Tonya said, for instance, economic growth. And the IMF and World Bank framework, for instance, of investing in women because it's a smart investment or it's smart economics, is really something that has a lot of consequence in policy making, and then in subverting the inequalities that we have in our societies. But also, this is not limited to the instrumentalization of women's rights. We are not talking only, for instance, about urban heterosexual women. We are talking about the women and men and all diversities. And so when we talk about gender, we need also to bear in mind that we are trying to change power relationship about what is understood to be women and what is understood to be men. And in this sense, we also need to challenge how gay and lesbian rights are being promoted in some places as a new consumerist sector, as a new way to boost the economy, and what it's called also the pink capitalism, right? So we need to challenge this reduction of women's economic rights to women empowerment, and that's what we have in the goals. We don't have women's rights, we have women empowerment. And we have a promotion of specific agendas, such as women access to ITC, to credit. So this issue of, okay, we include women because we are doing financial inclusion, it's already raised and it's there in the elements paper of the FFD conference that is coming now. So we really need to move forward this, to move to the old add women and steer, or add gay and lesbian and steer, and to challenge the market-based approach to and to move to a sustainable development and human rights-based approach to development. And so this is thinking beyond the development silos, and this is thinking about new forms of sustainable production and consumption, and a redistribution of wealth, of power, but also time. And so when we talk about gender and development, we are talking about to look at this, to avoid this automatic link between gender equality and economic growth, and to look at the specific patterns of economic growth and the distributional effects according to gender, race, age, territories, and look, for instance, at the quantity and the quality of the job creation, but also job destruction or livelihood destruction, and the access to resources, the distribution of care work, but also it's implied from our perspective from the South to review and to challenge the international norms and rules in terms of trade or finance, on intellectual property rights that are really shrinking the policy space of governments, but especially from governments from the developing countries, to fulfill their human rights obligation and promote alternative development policies, for instance, that can help us to move to a more productive diversification in sustainable and employment-intensive sectors, or linking finance with real economy, and tackling structural discrimination based on gender, race, and other issues. So for us, we really need to move and to overcome this false dichotomy between human rights versus development, which we have been hearing in these global spaces, because we say that we cannot have development without human rights, but we cannot have human rights, at least from the South, without development or without removing the development obstacles we have at the global level. And so when we have heard in these negotiations with the Sustainable Development Goals, some governments from the South saying we cannot eat rights, we need investment to lift people out of poverty. For women, women cannot eat without rights, without a human rights, without a state where we can hold accountable for overcome structural inequalities. But also we say to the government from the North, we cannot have human rights without removing the global obstacles that are preventing our governments to move and, to a gender-just development. And I have some examples that maybe we can discuss later in terms of how from Latin America we are trying to move this debate and forward to a gender-just and human rights-based approach to development.
Thank you, Nicole. Richie, can I ask you to come in on this?
Yes, certainly. I took a sort of different perspective in that I looked at it from the position of, instead of seeing sex and gender as inherently structuring, I see them rather as social variables within a development paradigm, which ultimately shape the citizen subject and ultimately also define, therefore, their access to, their movement through, or their ultimate exclusion from that kind of development system. And I think the use of the word structure and structuring and the imagery it invokes is important, yeah? I like the metaphor. If we think of development as a paradigm, as a system, which is what it is, which has a particular shape, which is shaped by the values, the attitudes of policymakers, and shaped in terms of being reflective of norms, then we understand that it is important for policymakers to not make certain assumptions that might be particularly damaging or that might be particularly exclusive. So to think about it from my own regional perspective, which is the Caribbean, Grenada is a Caribbean country. The Caribbean as a region has the second highest HIV/AIDS prevalence rates. Governments understand this fundamentally as a development issue in relation to its impact on the labor force, but also in relation to the very real cost of treatment, particularly in the face of international funding streams for treatment becoming more and more diminished. And so governments have been sort of trying to put things in place policy-wise and in other ways to address the particular problem. But we also have another reality in the Caribbean, which is that LGBTI people are discriminated against. They face significant levels of stigma and discrimination. So what that ultimately means is that for LGBT people, they don't feel comfortable accessing healthcare. They don't feel comfortable going to get tested or knowing their status, particularly in very small island developing states where probably there are confidentiality issues around the healthcare system, and there's probably 1 degree of separation between any two people. So what that has ultimately translated into is a reality whereby within MSM communities particularly, you have higher per capita HIV/AIDS. Okay, MSM stands for men who have sex with men. And they are higher HIV/AIDS prevalence rates within that particular community. And that, coupled with the fact that given the stigma and discrimination, many LGBTI people have to perform heteronormativity, allows for HIV/AIDS to sort of transfer between communities. And so governments, in my view, are shooting themselves in the foot when they implement policies which ignore that reality, the reality of LGBTI people, which are heteronormative in its very assumptions. Because what it does is that it prevents government from doing targeted intervention. So for instance, in relation to HIV/AIDS, healthcare and education, there's no talk about the use of lubricants, for instance, or education around the peculiarities of anal sex, or education around the need for lesbians to practice protection when sharing sex toys. There's none of that. So there's this huge sort of policy gap that impacts us quite significantly. So I want to pitch to the policymakers in the room and really reaffirm the point that it is important to ask ourselves, what assumptions are we making? Because development has a particular shape, right? It is shaped, structures have particular shapes, and ultimately we have to ask ourselves, is it shaped in a way that allows ease of movement through for all citizens, or are we excluding any particular person, and what is the effect of that particular exclusion? I earlier mentioned assumptions of heteronormativity, but I think that in the case of the Caribbean, it's not so much assumptions as false assumptions per se, because assumption implies not knowing, right? Not knowing what the reality is, but in many instances, they know, policymakers know, Caribbean governments and leaders know what the particular reality is. But I think there's also a very dangerous misconception that being particularly and specifically responsive to those realities or an endorsement of those realities, which aren't necessarily true. And the Caribbean, as I suppose many other regions, is sort of schizophrenic in that as a region, we embody and express simultaneously this non-reconciliation between what the reality is and what our self-conception is. So in the Caribbean, we like to conceive of ourselves as a Christian nation, as a nation where children don't have sex, where gay men don't have sex, even though we know what the kind of reality is. So I want to kind of reaffirm again that as policymakers, it is important to ask ourselves, what assumptions are we making and how do they affect people on the ground and our economies or development, etc.
Thank you, Richie.
You're welcome.
Daisy, would you come in perhaps from a different perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Sharman. I would like to speak more, a little bit different on the Pacific part. As you all know, Pacific is a very small region within this world, and our issues are a little bit different. Of course, we have the gender issues, but we have our priorities as well. And just recently, we were able to have an initiative, the Pacific Partnership on Gender, Climate Change, and Sustainable Development. And we focus on the gender and the impact of climate change on gender. And this is something we in the Pacific, because we'll be the first one to be affected by the rising of the sea rise level. Just recently, before I came, there was another king tides that hit the islands, and there were people that were dislocated from their homes, and most of them were women, women with their children, and they were not prepared, for this climate change effect. And this is something that, must be included and include in the policy of the climate change to prepare to be gender responsive, and also to have allocation of money, funding for not just the government or women missionaries, but also for the CSO who are working closely in the grassroots level and educating to awareness on climate change and all the other areas. And another issues that rise up, it's the reproductive, that I also wanted to reproductive health rights. It's in the Pacific, teen pregnancy is still high, especially from the country, small country I came from, Marshall Islands. And we have came to find out that although we have all these reproductive birth controls and things, it hasn't gone out to the other islands, and they don't understand. They don't know that the means of using them and all these things. And what happened, it's really affecting the lives of the young mothers, because they're not ready yet to have babies, but they have babies, and they leave their babies with their parents. And many of these parents, when the father died, just another woman taking care of many little ones. And I was fortunate to go and witness one of the islands that was affected by the king tides and also the drought. And I could see many women, they were left with their children and they were not prepared. When they struck their homes, they were homeless. And this is something I see that for us in the Pacific, we must include it and make sure that there are funds available and finances that must be allocated, not just for the government, but also for the GSO. And in this initiative, we came together, the civil society and the government sectors. We all came up with all our issues together and came up with outcome documents that we put up together jointly to address the needs of the impact of the climate change on genders, and also must be put into a development stage. And I chose to brought this on because I understand there are these international partners and donors that we often look up to, and we need your support in this area. As we know, if the continue of burning fossil fuels by the developed countries, the P countries here, will be the most affected. And this is why I chose to talk about the climate change and gender. I see that it's a priority for us at this time in comparison to the other bigger countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Daisy. Akshay, can we hear from you?
Yeah, I want to bring look at it at a slightly more macro political kind of way. What kind of role does sexuality and gender play in a larger kind of political sphere and political economy more broadly? I think what we've heard thus far, we've heard a lot of detail of particular policies, of particular imaginations of the subject of development. But I think it's important to zoom out and look at a broader level of politics itself. And I want to take the example of what's happening in India right now. In India right now, we have something that is quite close to what would be considered as textbook fascism, where you have the coming together of the religious extremism with very powerful crony capitalism, along with with a very charismatic leader who is above the fray, who's like a god, who can destroy law with without any reference to a ground level relationship with politics, etc. Now, the Modi government came into power on the basis of formally on the basis of a mandate of development, right? And that's what makes it really important to look at how that happened and what that means. What does it mean in terms of development as a political object? Significantly, he did not have to explain what he meant by development in the campaign towards the election. It was as though no one else had ever spoken about development, even though the Indian state for 65 years has been just about has been a developmental state by definition. So what was it that actually functioned in this in this election was pretty much his 56-inch chest. Right? There's a certain kind of masculinity, an aggressive masculinity, which harks back to an earlier time where there was, the rise of the Hindu right in India itself was about what Thomas Blom Hansen calls the recuperation of masculinity. This idea that the Hindu male was emasculated first by the Muslim invader and then by the colonial powers, etc., etc. And we've gone through a process of recuperation of that Hindu masculinity significantly through empowerment in the political economies and the sense of entrepreneurship, et cetera, right? And now is the time of the Hindu male, right, to take over the world. We don't simply throw away the companies that used to dominate us. We buy them over, you know. And the rise of Indian capitalism with the Ambanis and Adanis, et cetera, and Modi embodies that, right? What is that? What is that figure? That figure that every person must be in love with, one who cannot be challenged, one who cannot be lampooned. It's 8 months since we've had this government. There's not a single mainstream newspaper cartoonist who has dared to lampoon this figure. This figure is, you know, and what are the elements of that figure? What is the heteropatriarchal matrix that makes that figure possible? Right? That's the larger question of sexuality and gender, how they very much structure our political subjectivity, our political participation, and how that relates to economics as well, to economic policy. So what is now we know, of course, what Modi's notion of development is. It is crony capitalism. The first few things that they've done is get rid of environmental impact assessment, ease out land acquisition by the big corporations, do away with most labor protection, et cetera, essentially all law, and do away with right to information, all the rights that have been accumulated over the decades are very directly being eroded in the interests of crony capitalism. Now, what is the structure of that capitalism? What are the implications in terms of gender? So you're looking at special economic zones, you're looking at large-scale projects, you're looking at displacement. We know over the decades, we've seen the meaning of feminization of poverty, the invisibilization of care work that happens in the slum, in the context of urban poverty. There's something quite specific about the burden that is faced by women. So it's not that the economic policies is somehow, and we've heard about this from Nicole already, that there's a continuity between the broader political economy, the social psychology, etc., which enables Modi to come into power, and the actual implications in terms of gender and sexuality of those policies. So to me, when we're saying that we need to have a queer approach or consider sexuality and gender in the way we approach development, it's not about what are the implications for LGBT people or for women of a certain class, etc. It's the broader question of how we understand political economy itself, how we understand development itself. It's about the lens through which we frame the very problem of development, and in today's context, sustainable development. I think that's what I would like to add to the conversation.
Also, I would like to say that at least I have two examples from Uruguay that has some potentiality in order to overcome this. One is that you know that tax incentives for attracting foreign direct investment is a big development challenge, and it's something that all our governments are doing, and we need to enter in this debate with some concrete proposals. And what Uruguay is trying to do now, even if it has a very liberal policy, is to reorient investment to implement investment promotion scheme to allow corporate tax exemption, but if projects contribute to a specific development objectives from the government. And now the development objectives are clean production, innovation, territorial decentralization, and quality employment for women, rural workers, people under 24 years old, and people above 50 years old. This is a specific idea to reorient FDI to what it's called sustainable development, equitable development, that can be looked at it. As well as there are other policies in terms of how do cash transfer for trans people who are overrepresented in poverty because of structural discrimination. There are positive examples that we can also share with you later on.
Thank you, Nicole. Wonderful. Very rich presentations, all four of them, and very different perspectives. I'd like to throw the floor open for questions.
Thank you. My name is Anne Hendrickson. I'm the director of PopDev, which is a center on peace, population, and the environment. My question is around reproductive justice. as an advocate for reproductive justice, I'm deeply concerned about the mass dissemination of long-acting and hormonal contraceptives and what that could mean in terms of a full platform for sexual and reproductive health. And specifically the introduction of targets and the narrowing of options that are related to these dissemination campaigns, trying to get people to switch to these. So there's a narrowing aspect and a sort of not paying attention to the full health picture potentially, but also recentering of fertility is the main concern of sexual and reproductive health, and a blocking of considerations of gender and the ways that people have sex, and marginalizing a lot of people from these massive campaigns. And aligned with that is a concern about a specific method, which Depo-Provera, which is being disseminated while there's still an ongoing controversy about the relationship between Depo and HIV acquisition and transmission. So this speaks to a real segregation of HIV services and sexual and reproductive health services. So I'd welcome any of your comments on those things.
Thank you. My name is Pooja, and I'm with Center for Budget and Governance Accountability based in Delhi, India. My question is perhaps most relevant for Akshay. I was just wondering if we've really done enough to understand sort of localized forms of homophobia, for instance. I feel like, at least in India, the conversation is always, it's a very simplistic discussion of how homophobia is just an outcome of colonialism, but without engaging enough with, say, the intersectionality of class, caste, language. So you have a section that's very comfortable with LGBTIA, MSMs, and understands that, but would be very uncomfortable with sort of gender identities of, which like lower class or caste, and who don't identify themselves as LGBTI, MSMs, and whatever their global language is. So I think, how do we translate more sort of just policies, without understanding what are these localized forms of homophobia or injustice that's happening? So I think that's my question. Thanks.
Pooja's question, I think I might preface your question with another. We need to understand localized forms of sexuality, sexualness, and gender articulation. And that's one of the crucial problems when we're talking about the geopolitics of sexuality and development, where the approach to the question of sexuality is already framed in terms of LGBT rights, and now we're talking about same-sex marriage, et cetera, stuff that is completely, irrelevant to the political frame. In the Indian context, there's several things happening, including, there is the urban English-speaking LGBT kind of space. There's the more politicized queer space, but there's also the very significant hijra space. There's Hijra has won an election 2 weeks back as a mayor of a small town. There's a history of MLAs, etc. Hijra is, in India, we have several genders. If you apply for a visa to India, you have 3 options for gender: male, female, and other. That's also in our passports, etc., and that's true of most countries in South Asia. And Hijra is the most well-recognized third gender category, which has been recognized in law. It was also criminalized by the colonial period, etc. So there's a complex question, but there's also various different political spaces that are relating to each other, but most often are cut away from each other. So there's a lot of work to be done in that context, and I think it's very important to point to the need for not simply an indigenous language of politics, but rather new. If you're talking about the transnational, you're talking about the international, there's similar kinds of phenomena in most parts of the global south, but those conversations get subsumed under this LGBTIQ kind of thing, and that is a new form of imperialism, that sexuality in the entire world is simply a variation of the way it's been recognized in Europe and North America. That is the challenge. So it's not simply about local indigenous. It's about changing the ways in which sexuality and gender are appreciated the world over. I think that's the challenge. And finally, with respect to the question of reproductive justice, etc., I think we are at a very dangerous point where there is the return to population control. And that is happening primarily through climate change discourse. So you've got this entire ridiculous idea of population offset, right, which is that corporations or governments can invest in the control of fertility of women in the global south, then there'll be a calculation of how many kids, how many brown and black kids have been prevented from being born. And on that basis, you can offset and emit that much carbon. The way, and I'm trying to work this through an idea of bioavailability, that there's ways in which bodies in the global south are brought into the calculations of capital. And I think the question of reproductive rights, reproductive justice is very central to these processes. So this coming together, especially the fact that this is sustainable development goals and the idea of planetary boundaries, et cetera, the burden of that is going to be faced by women in the global south. There's no getting away from that, and that is why this is a very, very significant point to be taken up in in the post-2015 agenda, et cetera.
Right, and I'd just like to expand on that. Sure. I think in relation to the sexual and reproductive rights issue, it's a broader discourse that needs to be had around development and consumer awareness, because I don't think it's quite specific to sexual and reproductive issues and the production of dangerous contraceptives, right? Because within development discourse, there's, okay, we need to develop, let's make food more available. But what kind of food? What's the quality of the food necessarily? A lot of the food killing people in the same way that the contraceptives are. So I think it is crucial that within development discourse, there needs to be an awareness reason aspect, because ultimately corporations are about their bottom line. They would keep producing as long as consumers keep consuming. So I think we need to address it at the level of the consumer, at the level of the women who must understand, what am I putting in my body, what am I putting in my body, and how is it affecting me? So I think that kind of discourse needs to be featured within the broader conversation as well.
Estamos en resistencia aquí en San Miguel. Nosotros somos las legítimas dueñas de nuestras tierras.
Ustedes mismos van a ser los mineros. El desarrollo de la mina se va a dar con ustedes mismos.
Economic models that we were bringing into countries like Guatemala were really about making rich people richer elsewhere.
Endless mine in sight. There's no doubt that the gold is as far as the eye can see.
Se sentía como un temblor, las casas están partidas.
Pero si la naturaleza se destruye, prácticamente el nahual de la persona se destruye.
We're not going to eat gold, we're not going to bathe in gold, we're not going to drink gold.
Está contaminada y ya no es para uso humano.
Allá donde está la represa de Cola, que tomen pues.
No hay problemas sociales para ustedes, amigos de Ixtahuacán.
No son problemas sociales.
Nosotros mañana vamos a decir la verdad.
Que la empresa ha venido a hacer una división aquí en nuestra comunidad.
It's tragic, the role that we've played just to defend corporations.
Je pense qu'un bon usage des ressources qui sont les nôtres pourrait nous mettre à l'abri aujourd'hui de ce type de manipulation de l'opinion publique internationale qui consiste à dire qu'on a annulé alors que ce n'est qu'une fausse annulation. Ce que nous allons sauvegarder, c'est peut-être quelques milliards par an au titre du service de la dette que nous remboursons, c'est tout. Mais cette décision a plus contribué à soigner l'image du G8 qu'à servir l'Afrique. Donc quand on me dit que je n'ai pas proposé de programme, je ne prétends pas proposer de programme. Je voudrais seulement qu'une masse critique d'Africains en sache davantage sur pourquoi nous en sommes là.
Monsieur le Président, je puis être d'accord avec le témoin, ce n'est pas la mission d'un écrivain de proposer un programme. Et je suis aussi d'accord sur le fait qu'un écrivain doit dénoncer ce à quoi il assiste, qui peut faire part de ses sentiments personnels, livrer ses réflexions. Mais tout à l'heure, Madame, vous êtes sortie de ce rôle. Vous vous êtes posé ici, à cette barre, comme un expert. Vous êtes venu sur des questions précises. Vous avez abordé le problème de la dette. Vous avez dit que la dette appauvrit c'est une discussion, et que l'abandon de la dette, et vous venez de le réitérer, eh bien, est sans aucune conséquence.
Je suis citoyenne de ce pays. J'ai les pieds solidement ancrés dans les réalités de ce pays. Écrivain n'a rien de contradictoire avec une certaine expertise, précisément pour ne pas être malmené en cas de débat contradictoire par rapport à des questions que je sais et que je vis de l'intérieur. L'avènement de la Chine est une donne qu'il faut intégrer dans ce débat. Vos propres pays tremblent devant la Chine. Et que va faire le Mali? Donc moi je pense que la filière cotonnière est une filière terminée. De toutes les manières, les prix des produits aujourd'hui qui nous viennent de Chine, avec nos textiles qui sont copiés, il n'y a pas d'enjeu majeur pour nous dans ce débat sur le coton.
يعني ما نجموش نحكيو على واقع تشغيل من غير ما نحكيو على استثمار، من غير ما نحكيو على طرق الاستثمار هذا. أنا نشوف من أولويات الحكومات في الدول اللي قام فيها ثورات هي تو مراجعة المديونية الخارجية، مراجعة هذه القروض، طريقة التدين، التدقيق في طرق صرف اللي صارت في الأنظمة في الفترات السابقة من الحكم، هي ممكن تكون أول خطوة نحو طريق إصلاح المنظومة الاقتصادية اللي هي بطبيعة باش يكون تأثيرها اجتماعي.
وبالتالي أنا أفتكر واحدة من أولويات المنظمات النسائية في المنطقة العربية أن نفتح حوار شجاع وبناء مع الأحزاب السياسية، يكون هناك التزام سياسي من الأحزاب السياسية تجاه قضايا النساء.
أظن أنه بعد الثورة نظرياً كل الحكومات وكل مكونات المجتمع المدني لا يمكن أن تكون لها غير مقاربة حقوقية، لأنه سبب قيام الثورة هو المطالبة بالكرامة وبحقوق كل مواطن، وبالتالي ولو نظريا يعني كل الحكومات ملزمة باتخاذ المنظومة الحقوقية بعين الاعتبار في جميع القوانين وفي الدستور وغيرها.
يعني احنا نقولوا شنو نحبوا نعملوا، وين باش نوصلوا مازلنا ما نعرفوش، لكن عندي ثقة في الناس اللي وقفت وقالت كلمتها بما أنهم مازالوا ثابتين في مواقفهم. صحيح التقدم قاعد يمشي بخطى نجموا نقدموا بخطى ثقيلة، لكن الأكيد اللي هي ثابتة.
Hi, good morning or afternoon. It's nice to be in a freezing day in New York and to remember why it is that I chose not to live in New York. Thanks to Anita for the invitation and to the Weather Channel for telling us what's going to happen. I'm going to try to give you, in a bit over 10 minutes, what I think is happening with governance. To tell you where I'm coming from, I have just finished a history book on international financial architecture that goes from 1850 to 2008. It took me 10 years to do the research and write. I have been working on debt issues for 35 years, and I have watched how institutions have changed, but how the actors have changed and how the weight of the actors have changed. And then I have also watched how this, that was sort of centered in the financial sector, is now broadening and it's happening in the rest of the multilateral system. So the the beginning of the thing is, my impression is that we have a crisis of multilateralism. And the crisis of multilateralism is related to the change in the international power structure. I mean, we have to understand, and I'm going to jump quickly, we have to understand that what used to be the G7 on top, and it is institutionally still called the G7, are no longer the 7 largest economies. And that's a big part of the problem. I mean, there's only one European country left in the top 7 largest countries, and that's Germany. The second thing, of course, is that you have the new emerging, the big emerging actors who are in the top 7, which are Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And this, of course, leaves a leadership crisis. It's easier to have 7 countries of about the same size, of about the same GDP per capita, agree amongst themselves on leadership, and then with a certain structure, a power structure that is a result of the Second World War, then decide and negotiate with the rest of the world. That's one scenario. But when on the top you have such different countries as the US, Japan, Germany, and then China, India, Russia, and Brazil, then how do we negotiate North-South, or how do we negotiate technical cooperation, to name a few? So the other problem is, of course, because of the change in the power structure, you have a change in the representation in the institutions. Look at the 43% of the IMF vote, and this is referred to the IMF, because I thought that was a good proxy for what's going on in the multilateral system on the whole. 43% of the votes are represented by those 7 countries. The next 7 hold, I don't know if I can bring this down. Can I? Is it possible? No. Well, the next 7 hold something like 17% of the votes. So there's a massive disproportion in the multilateral system in sense of voting power. We don't see how this adds up, but here, if you put the largest 7 now with a new, you see the amount of reserves. It's $6 trillion. The next 7 don't add to very much. I mean, if you look at what's happening with the rich countries, and I'm going to say the bad word, if you use the World Bank criteria of indebtedness, of highly indebted, low indebted, middle indebted, rich countries are highly indebted. So how you have a multilateral system where the highly indebted rich countries that have no growth, that don't have international reserves compared to imports, 2 months, 2.5 months, have the currencies, the reserve currencies, and define global interest rate policies. Really? Are we sure? And the rest of the large countries sort of have to accept this passively. Why? And I think that's the issue. And that's why multilateralism is in crisis, from my point of view. Here you have just general numbers. The indebtedness of the G7s, of the formal G7, they have 212% the debt of the BRICS countries plus 3. They are 20% larger in terms of GDP, and they have 43% less international reserves than the BRICS plus 3. but they have 309% the number of votes of the other ones. That is a nonsense. That's an absolute nonsense. So what happens when the institutions do not reflect the change in the power structure and economic reality? They become hopeless. And it happened in 1890, and it happened in 1907, and it happened in 1919, and we've seen it again in 1929. Why do you think the League of Nations disappeared? Why did the Corporation of Foreign Bondholders disappear? Because the world power structure changed. And the thing is, how is then policy made possible in an increasingly global world when you have a situation of a multilateral crisis? And the answer to that is you bilateralize the mechanisms. And they become increasingly bilateral. So you have a multilateral system, which is there, but if you look at the League of Nations, at the end, the League of Nations was the dialogue between two, the United Kingdom and whomever. That's what it was. And it was designed as the first big multilateral institution. And it ended up being a dialogue between the United Kingdom and whomever. To the demise, I mean, to the peril of the League of Nations. And I have the impression that's what's going on. What we're having is this bilateralization of the relationship. But on top of it, it is one thing when we speak of multilateral public and bilateral public, but then on top, private interests are defining the global agenda. So the bilateral relationship is becoming privatized on both ends. You have a privatization of the bilateral relationship. You have a privatization of the state in the emerging economies, an increasing privatization of the state. You have the same problem of the presence of the financial sector that you have in the United States, the same problem you have of the people going from Wall Street to the Treasury, that is clear since 1980. We have it in Brazil, in Chile, in Peru, and you keep on going. In Ghana, I can name 1,000 countries, Germany. That's the way it's working. We're having the states become privatized in their logic of functioning and become more interested in defending certain private interests than the common good. And that's the way the global negotiations are done. So this converts the international system from a multilateral system to a bilateral system, from a bilateral public system to a bilateral private system, and what we have is now, what I would say is, it's like a détente. The system is changing, but the new actors are not acting, and the old actors are not giving up their power, because why should they? And if nobody is questioning, then nobody is going to give up anything. So what you have is this tension it's a dysfunctional tension. And in the middle of this, we have the Millennium Development Goals, we have the Sustainable Goals, we have all kinds of multilateral agreements that, okay, as long as the bilateral actors are there, this is going to function to some extent. If for the bilateral actors it's not useful, it will not function. The multilateral system will not have the capacity to enforce it. And I think that's where we are. and I hope I haven't depressed you. Thank you very much.
Oscar spoke to us yesterday on numbers of private interest, which in a way match what Nancy Alexander was talking yesterday about billions and trillions of dollars mobilized across borders by financial interest without any kind of regulation or control over them, that lead to the title of our session around the corporate capture, precisely of governance and of many of our governments, north and south. Now for the good part, I would say, is that this capture is not uncontested. And yesterday we commemorated, for example, the 4th anniversary of the revolution in Egypt that brought a new actor into the scene that everybody thought or had forgotten, that was not in any analysis, not even of the development sector and analysis. Actually, in 2010, if we looked at the 2 leading development publications that from quite different points of view shape the thinking about development, the Doing Business report of the World Bank and the Human Development report of UNDP, both of them were saying that the 2 best countries in the region of Africa and Middle East were Egypt and Tunisia. And that was clearly not the opinion of the people in those countries, precisely because in both of their analyses, key factors were absolutely absent. So, Eva, 4 years after that, who is capturing the Arab state?
Thank you, Roberto. I think what the Arab states bring to the discussions around financing development and around the SDGs is the transitional context. And I think this is a key context because as we saw from the last short clip from the movie on Arab women in the revolutions that was produced by the Arab NGO Network for Development, one of the key issues about the Arab region now is that we are not just looking forward towards how we want to see the development of our regions, but we are also looking backwards at the legacy of injustices that we have witnessed and how we can undo these injustices. And I think this is key to understanding the struggles that the people in the Middle East have been going through in the past 4 to 5 years, since the outbreak of unprecedented uprisings in several countries. The most popular of are the Egyptian and the Tunisian uprisings. And one of the key issues that I want to address here is the very question of whether the states are able to address the demands of their people or not in light of the new power structures. And from the experiences we've had in Egypt and Tunisia, let me focus on one of the key issues that was always contested and continues to be contested in both countries, which is the issue of corruption. We have many human rights violations, we have many problems on many levels, but when we come to the issue of corruption, particularly because it comes to these questions of power relations and the relationship between the corporates and the states, and it really touches upon the question of whether our states still hold the power, or is it that they have really given up the power and the accountability completely to the corporates. And in Egypt and Tunisia, there have been many struggles to rethink about Ben Ali and Mubarak's economic policies. There have been many struggles, as we saw in the short clip, to re-question the question of debt and see whether that was odious debt, because we haven't seen any development realized by these money flowing into the region. And these very questions have been completely ignored by our governments, but in fact what has been happening is In light of rising claims by investors, foreign investors, against our states, and Egypt, let me tell you, has been one of the top 4 countries sued in front of international arbitration panels by foreign investors on issues that I'll come to you about shortly, because they're such outrageous issues that investors are bringing claims against Egypt on. And in light of this, what Egypt has been doing is moving very fast towards changing and altering its investment framework in order to make sure that investors are unchallenged. And this is not just Egypt, this is Tunisia as well. Tunisia has completely changed its investment code. Egypt has completely changed its investment code. And this to ensure a couple of points, but most importantly, to ensure that citizens, like myself, cannot go to court and sue the government or corporates on any violations of contracts. So if my government is selling land to a foreign investor or to any kind of investor, I cannot go to court and question that contract. Instead, what the new laws have suggested is that unless the Minister of Investment sees something wrong with these contracts, those contracts will remain unchallenged. Now, let me tell you that both Egypt and Tunisia have gone through long periods of very corrupt deals of privatization that not only privatized key sectors and key manufacturing sectors in both countries, but have also brought a lot of violations to workers' rights. I will finalize by just talking about one example of the struggles that Egyptians have led against these kinds of privatizations that also violated workers' rights. In light of the workers' struggles in Egypt, which are very, very high and are very important really in the Egyptian public space, the Egyptian government did a good step of moving towards introducing a new minimum wage. So a French multinational company starts a claim in front of ICSID against Egypt and saying that the new minimum wage, which by the way, Egypt has not set in practice for the private sector. It was only intended for the public sector employees. So they basically said that the new law for minimum wage will affect its investments in Egypt, and therefore asked Egypt for compensation for the damages that have happened to their investments in Egypt. And this is particularly what we're facing when it comes to thinking about negotiating things like ensuring workers' rights, ensuring that corporates don't get subsidies. We have been sued a couple of times by corporates just because the Egyptian government ran out of its natural gas reserves and could not afford to give to many international corporations natural gas, especially after the revolution in 2011. So it's really a question to us first about reclaiming the state in order to understand how can we work with that state towards addressing the legacy of the past, but also towards looking forward for development in our region.
Mohammed, you have been in power doing social policies, particularly gender policies. You are now in academia, watching and analyzing, and in civil society campaigning. In that scenario, what is the space or where could it come from to implement, for example, SDGs?
I think the question of governance is key to either succeed in achieving the objectives of the UN initiative, or in maybe hampering the development process. I mean, maybe one of the main problems is the institutional issue, and the fact that the state is captured by business elite. And in many developing countries, and especially in the Arab region, we have been seeing the development of crony capitalism. So all the opportunities that can be brought forward by the Financing for Development initiative can be diverted to the benefit, the exclusive benefit, the only benefit of this kind of tiny fraction of the population who is still in charge and control the state. So we have to figure out to understand first maybe the mechanisms through which the state capture happens. And these mechanisms are various. The cronies and the rulers, the cronies of the rulers are influential in getting laws which are appropriate for their interests. They can manage to influence the judiciary, the ministries, and through these mechanisms, they get a lot of privileges: finance, public procurement, discrimination in the implementation of regulations, trade protection, and so on and so forth. So the question is how to break down this nexus of state-business relations and promote a new state. How we can reinvent the state. I mean, how now it is clear that the state has to step in order to have and to make development happen. And but what kind of state? We need certainly we need the developmental state, but we need more a democratic and developmental state. A developmental state who is accountable to people. So what are the mechanisms to put in place in order to prevent and avoid that state capture happen again? And this is it's the question of democracy. But democracy is not just free election. Free elections. Democracy is about empowering people, is about making people toppling dictators. And we are now witnessing a lot of different experiences all over the world, like participatory democracy, in Latin America specifically, and people can now take to the streets what we call direct democracy. So all these mechanisms, I think, can be helpful in bringing in the developmental state, but the democratic and developmental state we need.
Thank you. Rosalia, I see you nodding vehemently. Why aren't just the old democratic mechanisms of elections and parliament enough?
Well, I think clearly in the context of the changes that we've seen globally, the old forms of democratic structures are not adequate. I think we pride ourselves in the Caribbean, for example, of having stable democracies. But with the exception of Haiti, say in the English-speaking Caribbean. But it's clear that that's not enough. We have to think about how we deepen democratic structures from two perspectives. The institutions of government, on the one hand, but importantly, the role of the citizen. And I think citizens have to see themselves as owners of the country with the responsibilities of ownership. Citizens have to see that their role in a democracy goes way beyond voting to monitoring and active engagement in the society and in monitoring what's happening with respect to government. And so we have relied on our representative form of democracy, and we recognize that it's not serving us well and it's not enough. Recently, the Latin American Public Opinion Project survey, the LAPOP studies in 2010, revealed that only about 4% of Jamaicans saw the member of parliament as an important aspect of democracy. And the 2012 study showed that Trinidadians and Tobagonians only felt that about less than 28% of public officials, their representatives, reflect their views and opinions. So there's a sense in which our elected and our representatives don't seem to be doing enough. And so Mohammed mentioned that we have to move towards more direct forms of democracy, whether it's through referendum. In our case, for example, in Jamaica, after 52 years of independence, we've not exercised our constitutional right to hold an election, a referendum. And so, of course, it requires, 2/3 majority and so on and so on. And the government have never put an issue to the people in terms of having their direct say on any issue. But there are other forms, whether it's ballot initiatives. This is something that we don't do in the region. We have to look at that very closely. Issues of recall and impeachment, those kinds of provisions don't exist. Very interesting, in the case of Jamaica, we now have a bill in Parliament with respect to impeachment. But beside those more difficult legal arrangements, there are policy positions that can be put in place. I mean, there's a lot of work that has been done increasingly with respect to participatory budgeting. And so whether at the local level or the national level, we can devise structures in which citizens can directly or indirectly influence policies. And so more and more we'll look into those kinds of forms. Other kinds of arrangements that are taking place, we have in Jamaica and in other parts of the region, social partnership arrangements, where we have civil society, private sector, trade unions, and so on around the table. And while it's a step in the right direction, some of us are concerned that without challenging those underlying institutional legal arrangements, without challenging them and changing them, these other mechanisms serve to strengthen the status quo. And so one has to be careful that while you open up space, you don't simultaneously reinforce the current arrangements where there is a dominance of the executive in parliament, and so anything the cabinet says is really rubber stamped in the parliamentary arrangement, and so you kind of have this hegemony of cabinet decisions. So I think we're recognizing the need to deepen the democracy, and we have to move in these kinds of directions, and it is happening in the region.
Thank you. Lopetti, before giving you the floor, I have to say two things. One is that if you look at that map, that contrary to the UN map that puts the center in the North Pole is putting the center in the South Pole, you see that the biggest part of the world is the Pacific Ocean. Yeah. And that's where Lopetti comes from Tonga, from the biggest region in the world. So you better listen carefully. The second thing that I have to say is that I met Lopetti in the late 80s as a human rights and environmental activism before the Rio conference. There were some people talking climate change and environment and so on even before Rio, so that make it happen. And now I see him transform from activist into government officer with executive responsibilities in the Kingdom of Tonga. So has your view changed?
No, in fact, my view has not changed at all. And in fact, I'd like to think that that Tonga has gone through the equivalent of the Arab Spring, I'd say a Polynesian Spring over the last 10 years, where the monarch of Tonga has voluntarily devolved most of his executive powers to an elected prime minister and an elected parliament. And the leader of that Polynesian Spring in Tonga 10 years ago is now the Prime Minister of Tonga, elected last year. So that's a major achievement in the road to democracy that we've gone over. And most of it peacefully, although there was a major eruption of violence in November 2006. But I'd also like to say that over that same 10-year period, the Human Development Index for Tonga has consistently stayed at 0.7. So we are in the high development category, just above we are ranked at 100, but at one stage we were number 75. But our HDI remains at 0.71, 0.2. We are next to Suriname and also the Dominican Republic. And that has consistently stayed the same. The revolution has not really extended to the rights of women, but there is something a mechanism in the process which will get this new government to ratify the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. But very quickly, I just also want to say that with the changes happening that we have heard from our leader, the impact on us is that although we've been able to maintain our HDI at 0.7 and kept ourselves in the high development category, we now have to rely on budget support from outside. Almost 10% of our recurrent budget is dependent on budget support, and that's the new development. And that is going to be a major threat in terms of whether or not the government, as the major actor, can maintain that HDI at that particular level.
Alexandra Garita with Research in Mexico. My question is related to, we've been talking about the corporatization of the United Nations and multilateralism generally. What hopes do you all have for reclaiming those multilateral spaces, as well as trying to put a dent in this, as I think Heba was saying, or Mohammed, this nexus between the business and the corporations and the government. So what role does civil society have to play there? And which allies can we find, be it the UN or other institutions, to move those progressive voices forward?
Thank you. I'm Patty Torsney from the Interparliamentary Union, and I was pleased that Rosalie talked about the need to pass laws and to make sure that there's participatory budget processes. And I guess my question would be, and I'm pleased to see someone is in government who used to be an activist, how do we make sure that civil society's goals and objectives are actually channeled through a parliamentary process, and that we can make sure that we don't just have people screaming over here and creating more Arab Springs if there isn't a connection to government, or Tonga Springs, but we actually get better government and get better governance and achieve the objectives. If there are other examples that you have, I hope that you'll bring them forward. Around the UN system, we hear all the time about the need for engagement with civil society and the private sector, and too infrequently do we hear the word parliaments and parliamentarians, because they have to be in the process and they have to make the laws and the policies and the oversight a reality if we're going to get anywhere on the SDGs.
Many citizens, and I can speak for the Caribbean, really, I think, have abdicated their responsibility as citizens to actively monitor and go beyond voting. And so there's an important first step that citizens have to actually experience the process of engagement. And so while I understand the limitations of the multi-stakeholder process, it becomes mechanisms in which citizens literally practice that engagement and that advocacy. And when you are around the table or when you engage in these processes, you learn. So it's a very important learning process. And I think as we go through those, I've had a very interesting experience with Trinidad and Tobago, where informally, the Minister of Finance engages groupings of citizens around the budget. And so proposals are sent and dialogue takes place. But after several years of doing this, one of the very dominant NGOs simply walked away, said it's just a talk shop, it's not happening, it's not yielding the kinds of outcomes that we want and we expect. So I think it's an important first step in addressing what was raised about how we rethink the parliamentary institutional arrangements, where we now have to think about hearings in Parliament, where citizens have a direct say. We have to really think about our Senate. We've inherited a Senate structure, for example, in the case of Jamaica and much of the region, where you reproduce the party political structure that's in Parliament in the Senate. And so you don't have new voices. So you get a rubber stamping arrangement in one house and in another house. And so there has been discussion about how do we get civil society representatives in the Senate to have independent voices having say. And changes like that, I think, are absolutely necessary. And citizens have to just play that important role of pushing for deeper say.
Yeah, I think I go back to the negotiations that was happening prior to Rio, and the discussions amongst the civil society organizations that were participating in the PrepComs, and the new coinage that came into being then was major groups. So major groups then became the accepted definition that allowed the representatives from the civil society organizations to be in the same grouping as the representatives from Coca-Cola and Westinghouse, etc. And I think that's where the damage was done. We gave up our space then to the transnational corporations. And this is where they've taken over our space in the partnership that is supposedly being proposed now, I'm afraid, yeah.
Maybe just a few words about civil society. Personally, I don't like too much stressing the concept of civil society. I feel like thinking of gatherings in hotels and UN rooms, while what's happening at the grassroots is more significant. And I am thinking of social movements who can change the power relations. And the hope is more maybe on the streets politics. Look what's happening in Greece, in Spain. But the issue is how to link social movements to the political sphere. How social movements can become a political actor. I mean, in control of government in order to implement some progressive policies in favor of the people, in favor of women, in favor of the trade unions, and so on and so forth. So we need to be critical about our behavior, about our actions, in order to make things change.
And I really see the irony in talking about multi-stakeholder discussions, and civil society organizations are under attack more than ever worldwide, and definitely the Arab states are no exception. Having said that, I think big corporations cutting funding or big donors cutting funding from key organizations is ironic and sad, and it's part of the power structure. But still, I think the kind of mobilization that we are witnessing worldwide is, at least in my opinion, the only venue for people to contest the system. So there is absolutely no other way to do it. So even with rising laws restricting and regulating protests and strikes and organization and just assembly, this will not regulate anything because people don't have any other venue, specifically with the privatization of governance. So of course, I'm concerned as someone who comes from a civil society organization, also in a hostile context where civil society organizations are not respected as they should be as partners in development and as key actors. But at the same time, I'm not concerned that this is not the end of organization. And just very shortly, I think on the question of the UN and multilateral fora, there are definitely many concerns about where the UN is going, and I think the Regions Refocus is a response, is one of the key responses to these concerns. And I personally don't work closely with the UN or anything, and I only get in touch through other networks and initiatives like Regions Refocus. But I'm pretty sure that many of us who have the concerns will still insist on the UN as the closest to representative to the different groupings, and therefore we will insist on making the system better and better rather than just abandoning it altogether. Because if we abandon the UN, I don't think there's a democratic multilateral forum left for us to participate through.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I think I just want to leave with a message of hope. We've been talking about the need to redefine the power base and the power structure. And I think Oscar sort of lamented the fact that the G7 is basically holding on to power that it doesn't reflect the current realities. I just want to share with colleagues around the table because there's a lot of hope placed on the Green Climate Fund as the financing mechanism in terms of how to try and respond to climate change. I sit as the alternate member for small island developing states on the board. And in Barbados last year, we took some very important decisions. I just want to share with you. First, the board is made up of equal numbers of developing and developed countries, 12 each. Secondly, we resisted temptation to have earmarks in terms of the contributions to the resources of the fund. And therefore, we also resisted the weighted voting so that your contribution is not going to be conditional on or your vote is going, no, you have a higher percentage. So everybody has an equal voting. But more importantly, we also ensure that, that country ownership was really enhanced to the extent that no proposal that is going to come from member states will be looked at by the board if it does not have the express approval in writing of the designated national authority. So irrespective whether the proposal emerges outside of the country or in country, that is a condition to ensure that at the end of the day, it's the national governments who basically has the final say. So I just want to share that because I think things are also happening. And I think it's all because of this frustration, reluctance in terms of the reality nowadays. But we are working at a very modest pace, but hopefully some of these governance issues will help us try to reclaim the individual member states' responsibility and right. I thank you.
Thank you. I think the Climate Fund is probably experimented with new forms of governance to avoid some of the problems. It now needs to be filled. We are still at 2.5% only of the goal set for the year 2020 of $100 billion a year. But I think on that note, that governance changes are possible when pressures are being resisted and quite strongly. And on the note of at the ground, there is a lot of energy everywhere, but we do need the UN system to also be at the, to meet the challenge, resisting its own being captured by those corporate interests that will come under the disguise of partnerships and different kinds of arrangements. I think that there is enough warnings, and I think that there is been a lot of energy in this room during the day. We can now go and face the storm and face the days of tough negotiations that are ahead in these days and from here till the end of this crucial year. Thank you very much to all of you for being here and for the organizers and our host.
So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for the launch of Regions Refocus 2015. Thank you also to everyone watching online. I know there are a lot of you. That was a smart decision today, so thank you. And I hope that today's event has given you a sense of what we're trying to do with Regions Refocus, of the kinds of discussions and connections that we're trying to facilitate. And in founding this initiative, Anita and I are trying to build new ways of working together across movements, across regions, that are then reflected in these global spaces. So to let you know what's coming up next for us, following this event, we're also launching video interviews with several of the participants that you heard and some that you didn't hear today. And that will also be a way to stimulate further discussion on these key structural issues and how they relate to human rights and to regional realities. And then moving forward in terms of post-2015 and financing for development, we'll continue to stimulate discussion, to facilitate spaces where policymakers and civil society can interact. So we look forward to including a lot of you in that work, and we thank you again for coming.
Right. Thank you, Katie. We'd also, yeah. And as Katie said, none of this work really would have been possible without the vision and creativity and leadership of the regional networks, many of whom that you've heard today, as well as the political collaboration that we've forged with sub-regional alliances and institutions in each of the sub-regions, both in government and in academia, and at the global level with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. We'd also like to acknowledge the Ford Foundation and the UN Institute for Training and Research, as well as the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation for their meaningful financial and institutional support to us. I'd like to say that two program officers, Lourdes Rivera and LaShawn Jefferson, have just been the most remarkable collaborators, and I thank you for your trust and your support for this initiative. And on our team in the office is our program assistant, Devin Teletin, and a very, very special and profound thanks to Victoria Cotino, who has really anchored this day and who has given us the framework that you've all enjoyed. So, Victoria.